Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Last Light. Chapter 1, The Grieve-Wind Coast. The silence that had swallowed our house whole after Michael died was the loudest thing I'd ever known. It pressed in, a physical weight on my chest, suffocating the memories, the laughter, the arguments, everything that had once filled the spaces between us. It was a silence made of his absence, and I couldn't breathe in it. So, when the lawyer's letter arrived, a crisp, impersonal summons from a past I barely acknowledged, it felt less like an inheritance and more like an escape hatch. Great Aunt Alara. I'd met her twice, maybe 3 times in my 36 years. A reclusive figure from my mother's side, someone spoken of in hushed tones and vague anecdotes about a life spent by the sea. The letter informed me, with stark legal brevity, that Alara Thorne had passed, and I, Clara Holloway, her closest living relative apparently, was the sole inheritor of her property, number 17, Grieve-Wind Point, along with a dilapidated lighthouse keeper's cottage and the towering, decommissioned lighthouse itself, on a stretch of Nova Scotian coastline so remote it barely registered on modern maps. Reprogramming, I'd called it when I told my parents, who'd looked at me with that familiar blend of concern and bewildered helplessness they'd worn since Michael's car had met the black ice. I need to reprogram myself. Get away from all this. All this was the sympathy card still trickling in, the scent of lilies that clung to the upholstery, the way Michael's bedroom door remained resolutely, achingly closed. It was the constant, internal replay of the policeman's voice on the phone, the sickening lurch of my stomach, the world tilting and never quite righting itself. The drive to Grieve-Wind Point was a descent into increasing isolation. Paved roads gave way to gravel, gravel to a rutted dirt track that threatened to swallow my sensible sedan whole. The sky, a bruised purple when I left Halifax, had darkened to an ominous slate gray. The trees, mostly spruce and fir, grew denser, their branches clawing at the car as if trying to pull me into their shadowed depths. Finally, the forest spat me out onto a wind-scoured headland. And there it was. The lighthouse stood like a forgotten sentinel, a pillar of gray stone against the churning Atlantic. Its paint was peeling, revealing darker patches beneath like old wounds. The lantern room at its peak was a shattered crown of glass and rusted metal. Beside it, huddled low against the unforgiving elements, was the cottage. It looked less like a home and more like something that had washed ashore and stubbornly refused to be dragged back out to sea. Its clapboard sides were a faded, salt-bleached blue, windows like vacant eyes staring out at the turbulent water. A wave of something cold, and not entirely due to the biting wind, washed over me. This wasn't just remote, it was forsaken. But the silence here was different from the one I'd left behind. This was the silence of wind and wave, of ancient stone and indifferent sky. It didn't hold Michael's absence. It held its own, older sorrows. The key, a heavy, rust-pitted iron thing, turned in the cottage lock with a protesting groan. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp plaster, wood smoke long cold, and an underlying, surprisingly sharp scent of the sea itself, not the fresh tang of the beach, but something deeper, brinier, almost metallic. Dust lay like a shroud over everything. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs dominated the main room. A small, pot-bellied stove stood cold in the corner. Upstairs, I found a single bedroom with a narrow bed and a dresser, and a tiny bathroom where the tap coughed out a rusty trickle of water. It was bleak. It was perfect. As dusk began to bleed into the gray afternoon, the promised storm rolled in. The wind howled like a banshee around the eaves, rattling the window panes in their frames. Rain lashed against the glass in furious sheets. The sea roared, its waves crashing against the cliffs below with the sound of distant cannon fire. I built a fire in the stove, the crackle and pop a small, defiant sound against the storm's fury, and huddled in a threadbare armchair with a book I had no intention of reading. The grief, always a dull ache beneath the surface, sharpened with the storm's intensity. Michael had loved storms. He would have been out in this, face to the wind, arms outstretched, laughing. The thought was a fresh stab of pain, and I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing it down. Reprogram, Clara. That's why you're here. To erase the old code, write something new. Or at least, something bearable. Exhaustion eventually claimed me. I retreated to the narrow bed upstairs, the sound of the storm a constant, violent lullaby. I must have slept, though it felt more like a descent into a murky, restless place. I woke with a jolt, heart hammering. The storm still raged, but beneath its roar, another sound had pierced my consciousness. Thump, thump, thump. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, moving across the wooden floor of the room directly below me. My breath hitched. I was alone. Miles from the nearest soul. The door was locked, the windows latched against the storm. Rationality fought against the primal surge of fear. Old house, I told myself. Settling in the wind. Timbers groaning. But this wasn't groaning. It was the distinct cadence of a footfall. A heavy boot, dragging slightly on the upstep. Then came the smell. Faint, almost imperceptible at first, cutting through the mustiness of the cottage, the sharp, slightly oily scent of salt-fired lanterns. The kind they would have used in the lighthouse, decades ago. It was a smell I knew from childhood visits to maritime museums, a smell that had no place here, now. I sat bolt upright, clutching the thin blanket to my chest. The footsteps stopped. The silence, save for the wind and rain, pressed in again, but it was different now, charged with a waiting stillness. And then, from downstairs, came a sound that made the blood freeze in my veins. A crackle. The unmistakable sound of an old radio, long dead, stuttering to life. A burst of static, then a faint, wavering voice, too distorted to make out words, cutting through the storm's noise before dissolving back into silence. My throat was dry, my palms slick. I didn't dare move. I stayed there, rigid with terror, until the first gray fingers of dawn began to probe the edges of the window. The footsteps did not return. The scent of lanterns faded. The radio remained silent. When I finally crept downstairs, a pale, trembling ghost in the dim morning light, everything was as I had left it. The fire in the stove was out, a pile of cold ash. The simple table and chairs stood undisturbed. The antique radio, a bulky, wood-cased model I'd barely noticed on a dusty shelf the day before, was unplugged, its cord coiled neatly beside it, thick with dust. It couldn't have made a sound. I sank onto one of the chairs, my legs threatening to buckle. Had I dreamed it? A stress-induced nightmare, fueled by grief and the unsettling atmosphere of this place. But the memory was too vivid, the sensory details too precise. The specific cadence of the footsteps. The unique scent of those old lanterns. The hair-raising crackle of that radio. My hands were still shaking as I unearthed a forgotten journal and a pen from the bottom of my duffel bag. The journal was one Michael had given me years ago, a beautiful leather-bound book I'd never found the right words to fill. Now, sitting at that old wooden table, with the storm-gray Atlantic churning outside and the echoes of an impossible night still clinging to the air, I began to write. October 17th, I wrote, the pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. Grievewind Point. First night. The lighthouse doesn't just keep watch over the sea. I think it remembers. And I think, last night, it wanted me to remember too. I didn't know what it wanted me to remember. But as I looked out at the towering stone sentinel, battered but unbowed, I had the distinct and chilling feeling that its memories were only just beginning to stir. And that my own reprogramming was about to take a very different, and far more terrifying, turn. The Last Light. Chapter 2, Whispers in the Walls. The days that followed settled into a strange rhythm, a push and pull between my attempts at normalcy and the cottage's subtle, insistent intrusions. I tried to establish a routine. Morning walks along the cliff path, the wind whipping my hair and clearing some of the cobwebs from my mind. Afternoons spent attempting to read, or staring out at the relentless gray expanse of the ocean. Evenings huddled by the fire, forcing down lukewarm soup and stale bread. But the house, the lighthouse, they were always there, a silent, brooding presence. The journal became my confidant, the repository for the things I couldn't explain, the things that made my rational mind feel like it was fraying at the edges. October 19th, I wrote, my handwriting growing spikier with each entry. Heard it again last night. Not footsteps, but something, smaller. Like teacups clinking. Faint, from the kitchen. Went down. Nothing. Stove cold. Just the wind. And that smell again, the lanterns. It's always strongest near the door leading out to the lighthouse itself, the one that's been boarded shut for years. I'd examined that door. Heavy oak, thick with layers of peeling paint, secured with a rusted iron bar and heavy nails driven deep into the frame. Whatever was on the other side was meant to stay there. Or, perhaps, whatever was on this side was meant to be kept out. The sensory imprints, as I started to call them in my journal, were becoming more frequent, though still maddeningly elusive. A snatch of a sea shanty, hummed by a voice that sounded old and cracked, seemingly drifting from the empty bedroom. The distinct aroma of pipe tobacco, heavy and sweet, lingering in the armchair where I often sat, even though I was meticulously careful about airing out the cottage. A fleeting warmth on the back of my neck, as if someone had just passed by, leaving the faintest disturbance in the air. I started to research. My laptop, connected to a sputtering satellite internet that was more often down than up, became my lifeline to the outside world, and to the past. I delved into local historical archives, searching for records of Grieve Wind Point, for any mention of Alara Thorn or previous keepers. The information was sparse. The Grieve Wind Light had been officially decommissioned in 1958. Before that, a string of keepers, mostly solitary men, their names listed with birth and death dates, or sometimes just a terse, departed post. There were hints of hardship, of storms and isolation taking their toll. One entry mentioned a keeper named Thomas Ashton, who in 1923, was found in a distressed state, speaking of voices in the light. He was removed from his post and, according to a later, almost parenthetical note, died in an institution a year later. A chill snaked down my spine as I read that. Voices in the light. October 21st, my journal entry read. Found an old photograph tucked into a loose floorboard in the bedroom. A man, stern-faced, with a magnificent gray beard, standing before the lighthouse. He's wearing a keeper's uniform. On the back, faded ink, T. Ashton, 1921. The light sees all. Is this the man who heard voices? The same voices I'm starting to sense. The photograph unsettled me deeply. Ashton's eyes, even in the faded sepia, seemed to hold a knowing, haunted look. I propped it on the mantelpiece, next to where the silent radio sat. Sometimes, I'd catch myself looking at it, half expecting his painted eyes to follow me. The replay phenomenon, as I'd morbidly termed it after one particularly vivid experience, was the most disorienting. It wasn't like seeing a ghost. It was more immersive. The first time it happened, I was in the kitchen, trying to coax a flame from damp kindling in the stove. One moment I was wrestling with the wood, the smell of soot and frustration in my nostrils. The next, the cottage around me changed. The light shifted, becoming brighter, yellower, as if illuminated by oil lamps instead of the weak daylight filtering through the grime-caked windows. The air grew warmer. Thick with the smell of baking bread and something else, stew, rich and savory. I heard voices, a woman humming a cheerful tune, the deeper tones of a man responding. For a disorienting few seconds, I saw it, the kitchen as it must have been decades ago. A worn but clean checkerboard linoleum floor instead of bare wood. Copper pots hanging from a rack. A woman, her back to me, kneading dough at a table that wasn't there. Then, as quickly as it had come, it vanished. I was back in the cold, dusty kitchen, the smell of soot acrid in my throat, my heart hammering. I stumbled back, knocking over the kindling. It had lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it had felt utterly, terrifyingly real. I hadn't been an observer, I'd been in it. I'd smelled the bread, felt the warmth. October 23rd. It happened again. The kitchen. This time, it was night. The storm outside was different, a summer squall, not the biting autumn gales. Lamplight. The same woman, younger now, arguing with a man. I couldn't make out the words, but the anger was palpable, raw. It clung to the air even after the vision faded. I felt a wave of her fury wash over me, so intense I had to sit down, my hands shaking. Whose anger was it? Ilara's? Someone before her. The lines between my own grief and these absorbed emotions were beginning to blur. Sometimes, an overwhelming wave of sadness would crash over me for no discernible reason, so profound it left me breathless. Other times, a flicker of irrational anger, or a sudden, inexplicable joy that felt utterly alien. It was as if the cottage itself was an emotional sponge, saturated with the feelings of generations, and now, it was leaking. The boarded-up door to the lighthouse tower became an obsession. The scent of lanterns was always strongest there. Sometimes, I'd press my ear against the rough wood, straining to hear anything beyond the constant sigh of the wind. I imagined Thomas Ashton on the other side, pacing the spiral stairs, listening to his voices. Were they the same imprints I was experiencing, amplified by the tower's isolation and intensity? One afternoon, driven by a gnawing curiosity that bordered on compulsion, I found a crowbar in the small, dilapidated shed behind the cottage. It was heavy, rusted, but solid. My heart hammered as I approached the boarded door. This felt like a transgression, a breaking of some unspoken rule. The old nails screeched in protest as I worked the crowbar, the sound echoing unnaturally through the quiet cottage. Each pull sent shivers down my spine. The wood was stubborn, resisting my efforts. Sweat dripped into my eyes. Finally, with a splintering crack, the first board came loose. Then another. Behind the boards was not the solid oak I expected, but another, older door. This one was made of heavy iron, pitted and scarred, with a massive, complex-looking lock mechanism that had long since seized. Carved into the iron, almost obscured by rust, was a single, chilling word, silentium. Latin. Silence. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a boarded-up entrance. This was a seal. As I stared at the iron door, a new sound reached me, not from the cottage, but from the other side of the silentium door. A soft, rhythmic scraping. Like fingernails dragging across stone. Slow, deliberate, and undeniably coming from within the lighthouse tower. I dropped the crowbar with a clang, the sound swallowed by the sudden, intense stillness that fell over the cottage. The scraping stopped. October 25th, I scrawled in my journal, my hand so unsteady the words were barely legible. The lighthouse isn't just remembering. There's something in there. Something that was locked away. And I think, dear God, I think it knows I'm here. The sense of being watched, which had been a subtle undercurrent since my arrival, intensified. It was no longer just the feeling of the house itself, but something more focused, more aware. I started sleeping with the crowbar beside my bed. The reprogramming I'd sought felt like a naive dream. I wasn't erasing old code, I was being written into a new, terrifying program, one whose parameters were set by the lingering imprints and ancient sorrows of Grievewind Point. And the dominant imprint, the one that scraped behind the iron door, was beginning to feel very, very aware. The Last Light. Chapter 3, The Keeper's Echo. The scraping behind the silentium door became a nightly occurrence. It wasn't constant, but intermittent, a patient, unsettling sound that wormed its way into my dreams and waking thoughts. Sometimes it was faint, barely audible above the wind, other times, it was sharp and insistent, as if whatever was in the tower was testing the strength of its prison. I never tried to open the iron door again. The single word carved into its surface, silentium, felt less like a name and more like a command, a desperate plea from the past. The imprints within the cottage grew bolder, more interactive. One evening, I was sitting by the stove, nursing a cup of tea, when I heard a distinct whisper from the direction of the boarded-up doorway. It was soft, raspy, like dry leaves skittering across stone. And it sounded, unmistakably, like my name. Clara. I froze, tea slopping over the rim of my mug, scalding my fingers. I didn't react, didn't turn. The silence stretched, taut and expectant. Then, again, fainter this time, as if sighing on the wind. Clara. It wasn't a memory replaying. This felt, directed. October 28th. It knows my name. I'm sure of it. It's not just random echoes anymore. This is different. Targeted. I keep thinking of Ashton. Voices in the light. Did they call his name too? The lines between my reality and the lighthouse's past were becoming dangerously blurred. I found myself performing small, unconscious actions that felt entirely out of character. One morning, I woke to find I'd meticulously polished the brass fittings on the old radio, a task I had no memory of undertaking. Another time, I caught myself humming a tune I didn't recognize, a mournful, seafaring melody that seemed to rise unbidden from my throat. I'd stop, confused, a disquieting sense of alien influence washing over me. The replays became more frequent, longer, and more deeply sensory. I'd be standing at the sink, and suddenly the view from the window would shift. The churning gray Atlantic would be replaced by a calm, sun-dappled sea, the sky a brilliant summer blue. I'd see sailing ships on the horizon instead of empty waves. The smell of salt and fish, the cries of gulls, all vividly real for a disorienting minute before the present reasserted itself, leaving me trembling and nauseous. One afternoon, while reading Thomas Ashton's photograph propped on the mantel, the room around me dissolved. I was no longer in the dusty cottage living room, but in the cramped, circular space of the lighthouse lantern room. The great lamp was lit, its Fresnel lens rotating with a rhythmic, hypnotic groan, casting powerful beams out into a raging blizzard. The wind shrieked, rattling the thick glass panes. I could feel the cold seeping through the stone, smell the hot oil of the lamp, hear the desperate clang of the fog bell being rung manually. And then I saw him. Thomas Ashton. He stood at the window, his back to me, peering out into the white chaos. He was muttering to himself, his voice low and agitated. "She'll not make it, not in this, the light must hold." I tried to speak, to ask him what was happening, but no sound came out. I was an invisible observer, trapped within his memory. He turned, his face etched with worry and a profound exhaustion that mirrored my own recent experiences. His eyes, those haunted eyes from the photograph, seemed to look right through me. Then, he reached for the fog bell rope, his hand passing directly through where my arm should have been. The sensation was bizarre, a cold, tingling emptiness. He pulled the rope, the bell clanging mournfully, and as he did, he spoke again, louder this time, his voice filled with a desperate plea. "Can you hear me? Are you there?" He wasn't speaking to anyone visible in the storm. He was speaking to the light, to the voices he heard. He was speaking, I realized with a sickening lurch, to me. Or rather, to whoever, or whatever, he perceived in his tormented solitude. The vision fractured, the lantern room dissolving back into the familiar dusty cottage. I was left shaking, the phantom cold of the blizzard still clinging to my skin, Ashton's desperate question echoing in my ears. October 30th. I was in the lighthouse. With Ashton. During a storm. He spoke, he was trying to communicate with something. Or someone. The voices in the light. Was I one of them, in his time? Or am I hearing? The most disturbing development was the growing sense that one particular imprint, Ashton's, was becoming stronger. More focused. It wasn't just his memories replaying, it felt as if his personality, his very essence, was attempting to resonate with mine. I started to find myself standing at the window, staring out at the sea for long periods, a habit I'd never had. My posture would change subtly, my shoulders hunching in a way that felt familiar from his photograph. Sometimes, when I spoke aloud to myself, a habit I was indulging more and more in the oppressive silence, my own voice would have a slightly different timbre, a rougher, older edge. One morning, I woke up and went to the small, cracked mirror in the bathroom. As I stared at my reflection, my own face seemed to shift for a fraction of a second. The lines around my eyes deepened, my jaw became squarer, my hair darker, graying at the temples. It was Ashton's face, superimposed over mine, looking back at me with an expression of weary recognition. I gasped and stumbled back, and my reflection returned to normal, but the image was seared into my mind. He was trying to overlay himself onto me. The thought was terrifying. Was this what had happened to him? Had he been consumed by the imprints of previous keepers, their loneliness, their despair, until his own identity fractured? The scraping from the tower grew more frantic. It no longer sounded like fingernails. It was heavier now, more forceful, like something trying to break down the iron door from the inside. And sometimes, amidst the scraping, I would hear a low, guttural moan, a sound of pure, animalistic rage and frustration. This wasn't Ashton. This was something else. Something the silentium door was meant to hold back. Something Ashton, perhaps, had been trying to keep at bay with his light, his vigilance. I felt caught between two forces. Ashton's lingering consciousness, seemingly seeking connection, perhaps even a way to finish some unresolved task. And this other, darker presence in the tower, a raw, primal entity whose intent felt undeniably malevolent. My grief for Michael, which had been the driving force for my escape to Grieve Wind Point, was still there, a constant, heavy weight. But now it was intertwined with a new, more immediate fear. I had come here to reprogram myself, to find a new way to live with my loss. Instead, I was in danger of being overwritten entirely, my own identity dissolving into the echoes of this haunted place. The journal was my only anchor. November 2nd. I feel him. Ashton. Stronger now. It's like he's sharing my senses. When the wind blows, I almost feel the salt spray on. The lighthouse, the cottage, Grieve Wind Point, it wasn't a place of quiet solitude. It was a battleground of lingering wills, of trapped emotions. And I was no longer an observer. I was becoming a part of its terrible, unending story. The last light wasn't just the beam from the tower, it was the fading glimmer of my own self, struggling against the encroaching darkness of the past. The last light. Chapter 4, The Crimson Tide of Memory. The merging with Ashton, for that's what it felt like, a slow, insidious osmosis of his being into mine, intensified with each passing day. It was no longer just fleeting sensations or momentary overlays. His memories, his skills, even his fears, began to bleed into my consciousness, as tangible as my own. I found myself knowing things I shouldn't. The precise way to trim a lamp wick for the cleanest burn, even though I'd never touched an oil lamp. The subtle shifts in wind direction that heralded a coming nor'easter. The names of ships long sunk, their phantom outlines appearing on the horizon during the replays, ships he would have known. I could almost taste the bitterness of his rationed coffee, feel the familiar ache in his back from climbing the tower stairs countless times. November 5th, woke up this morning with an old fisherman's knot tied in the cord of my bedside lamp. I don't know how to tie knots like that. My hands felt, his hands. Calloused, strong. For a moment, I looked at them, and they weren't mine. Then the sensation passed. But the knot remains. Proof. The grief for Michael became tangled with Ashton's own sorrows. I'd find myself weeping, not just for my brother, but for a lost love Ashton had mourned, a woman named Mary whose faded daguerreotype I later found tucked inside an old navigation manual. Her image would flash in my mind, a smiling face, wind-blown hair, and the wave of Ashton's longing would be so acute it felt like my own heart breaking anew. This shared sorrow, however, created a strange, almost comforting connection. Ashton's presence, while invasive, didn't feel entirely malevolent. It felt lonely, desperate. As if he were reaching out from his temporal prison for understanding, for someone to bear witness to his long-ended watch. But the other presence, the one behind the silentium door, grew increasingly agitated in response to Ashton's growing influence within me. The scraping sounds became violent, interspersed with guttural roars that vibrated through the very stone of the cottage. The iron door would sometimes visibly shudder in its frame. One afternoon, I was attempting to repair a leaking window sash, a task I approached with an uncharacteristic, Ashton-like practicality, when a particularly violent tremor shook the cottage. A low, furious growl echoed from the lighthouse, and then, with a sound like tearing metal, one of the boards I'd left partially pried from the lighthouse doorway splintered and fell to the floor. Through the gap, I saw the iron door again. But this time, fresh scratches, deep and savage, marred its rusted surface. They hadn't been there before. Whatever was in the tower was physically attacking its prison. And it was strong. The realization of what Ashton might have been fighting against began to dawn on me. The voices in the light he'd spoken of, were they like my imprints, or was he referring to this raw, furious entity? Perhaps his own descent into madness wasn't just from isolation, but from a constant battle against this thing. The replays involving Ashton became more focused, almost as if he were consciously guiding them, trying to show me something. One evening, as a fierce storm raged outside, mirroring the blizzard from his memory, I found myself back in the lantern room with him. This time, however, the scene was different. He wasn't looking out at the storm. He was hunched over a large, leather-bound ledger, the official lighthouse logbook. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his pen scratching furiously across the page. I couldn't see what he was writing, but I could feel his desperate urgency, his fear. "It's getting stronger," he muttered, his voice raspy, not to the light this time, but to himself, or perhaps to the logbook. "The old rituals, they're not enough. The tide, the crimson tide. Crimson tide." The phrase snagged in my mind. He looked up, his eyes wild, and for a moment, they seemed to fix on me, a flicker of recognition, of shared dread. "It feeds on the storms, on the sorrow. It wants out." Then he dipped his pen not in the inkwell, but into a shallow dish beside the ledger. A dish filled with a dark, viscous liquid. He began to write again, but this time, the script on the page was not ink. It was a deep, unsettling red. Blood. The vision shattered, leaving me gasping in the dimly lit cottage, the phantom scent of iron and something else, something viscerally unsettling, clinging to the air. I stumbled to the mantel, grabbing Ashton's photograph. His eyes stared back at me, no longer just haunted, but filled with a terrible, resolute purpose. He hadn't just been a keeper. He had been a guardian. And he'd used his own lifeblood, his own essence, to reinforce the wards, the rituals, that kept the thing in the tower contained. November 8th. The logbook. He was writing in blood. The crimson tide, was he referring to some astronomical event? Or something more literal? The entity in the tower, what is it? Not a ghost, not an imprint. Something older. Something that was here before the lighthouse. Driven by this horrifying revelation, I began to search the cottage with renewed intensity, looking for Ashton's logbook. If it still existed, it might hold the key to understanding what he was fighting, and perhaps, how to fight it myself. My search led me to a loose stone in the hearth, one I'd absently noted felt different underfoot. Behind it, wrapped in oilskin, was a slim, leather-bound volume. Ashton's log. My hands trembled as I opened it. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but legible. The early entries were mundane, weather reports, shipping sightings, notes on lamp maintenance. But as the dates progressed, the entries grew more erratic, more personal. He wrote of his loneliness, his grief for Mary, the encroaching storms, both meteorological and psychological. And then, the entries began to change. The whispers are louder tonight. Not Mary's voice. Something else. Old. Hungry. Found markings on the foundation stones of the tower. Ancient. Not of human making. The storm last night, it felt. And then, the entries that chilled me to the bone, written in that rusty, faded red. It clawed at the door. The crimson tide is a metaphor, yes, but also literal. It comes with the king tides, the storms that dredge the deep sorrows of the sea and the land. It draws power from them. It demands sacrifice. It showed me things. What it is. What it wants. This place is a wound, a thinning between worlds. The lighthouse is a pin, holding it closed. I am the thread. I slammed the logbook shut, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Ashton hadn't been crazy. He'd been fighting a desperate, solitary war against an entity of unimaginable horror, using his own life force to maintain the seals. And now, with him gone, and the seals presumably weakening, it was trying to break free. And I, by interacting with his imprint, by allowing this merging, had inadvertently become the new thread. His knowledge, his purpose, was now seeping into me. That night, the scraping from the tower was an unholy symphony of rage and power. The iron door buckled audibly. The entire cottage seemed to vibrate with the force of the assault. Suddenly, I knew what Ashton would have done. The knowledge bloomed in my mind, clear and undeniable, a fusion of his resolve and my own dawning terror. The crimson tide, it wasn't just an event, it was a method. I stumbled to the kitchen, my movements jerky, almost puppet-like. I found a sharp paring knife. My hand, or Ashton's hand in mine, closed around the handle. This was madness. I wasn't a guardian. I was a grieving woman who had sought solitude. But as I stood there, knife in hand, the image of Michael's smiling face flashed in my mind, followed by Mary's, her eyes full of a love Ashton had desperately clung to. The sorrow in the cottage, my sorrow, Ashton's sorrow, the sorrow of generations, it felt like a physical weight, a suffocating tide. And the thing in the tower fed on it. The scraping stopped. A profound, expectant silence fell. And then, a new sound. A wet, tearing sound from behind the silentium door. Not scraping. Something, pushing through. The choice was no longer mine to make. It had been made for me by the house, by Ashton, by the encroaching horror. The last light of my old self was guttering, and in its place, a new, terrible purpose was igniting. Chapter 5, The Seal of Self. The tearing sound from behind the silentium door ripped through the silence, visceral and sickening. It was the sound of something immense and powerful forcing its way through a barrier that should have been inviolable. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. The paring knife felt like a child's toy against the magnitude of what was happening. But Ashton's resolve, now a tangible part of my being, held me steady. His memories flooded me, the desperate nights, the fear, the unyielding commitment to his watch. He hadn't just been a keeper of the light. He had been a keeper of the boundary. The wound, the lighthouse is a pin. I am the thread, his words from the logbook echoed in my mind, no longer just text on a page, but a living imperative. The iron door groaned, a deep, metallic screech of protest as it began to visibly bulge outwards. Whatever was on the other side was no longer just testing its prison, it was breaking free. The air in the cottage grew colder, so cold that my breath plumed in thick, white clouds. The scent of decay and ancient brine, the true scent of the entity, overwhelmed the lingering traces of lamp oil and pipe tobacco. There was no time to think, only to act, guided by Ashton's grim knowledge. I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, what the crimson tide truly meant, what the sacrifice entailed. It wasn't just about storms and sorrow, it was about the offering, the voluntary surrender of a part of oneself to strengthen the seal. My hand, guided by his ghostly will, moved with a terrible purpose. The paring knife, surprisingly steady, pressed against the palm of my other hand. The decision was instantaneous, a horrifying fusion of my desperation and Ashton's ingrained duty. Pain, sharp and clean, lanced through me as the blade bit into my flesh. Warm blood welled, shockingly bright against my pale skin. It wasn't a deep cut, not life-threatening, but enough. Enough for the offering. As the first drops of my blood spattered onto the cold stone floor before the silentium door, the tearing sound from within the tower faltered. The outward bulge in the iron door receded slightly. The oppressive atmosphere in the cottage lessened, just a fraction, but noticeably. It worked. A wave of dizziness washed over me, the coppery tang of my own blood filling my senses. Ashton's presence surged within me, not with triumph, but with a weary, profound sorrow. He knew this path. He knew its cost. The entity in the tower reacted with a deafening roar of thwarted rage, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of Grieve Wind Point. The iron door shuddered violently, but it held. For now. Clutching my bleeding hand, I stumbled back to the hearth, to Ashton's logbook. My blood dripped onto its ancient pages, mingling with his faded, rusty script. I fumbled it open, my vision blurring, searching for more, for anything that could guide me. His later entries, the ones written in his own blood, were not just accounts of his struggle, they were instructions, fragmented and desperate, for his successor. The markings, they must be renewed. The old patterns. With the offering. Every cycle, when it grows strong. The light itself, it's a beacon, yes, but also a ward. Its purity repels, but it needs an anchor. A conscious will. Someone to. Do not let it speak to you. Its voice is madness. It twists truth, feeds on doubt. The markings. The foundation stones of the tower he'd mentioned. I had to get into the lighthouse. Not to confront the entity, but to reinforce its prison from the outside, using Ashton's methods. But the silentium door was the only way in, and it was clearly compromised. As if in answer to my thought, a new sound began from the tower, a rhythmic, powerful thudding, as if a battering ram were being brought to bear against the iron from within. There was no time. My gaze fell upon the boarded-up window in the living room, the one that faced the lighthouse. Ashton's memory supplied the answer. There was another way, a keeper's access, long disused, a narrow passage that connected the cottage cellar directly to the base of the tower, bypassing the silentium door. It had been sealed decades ago, deemed unsafe. Hope, fragile but fierce, flickered within me. Guided by Ashton's spatial memory, I found the cellar door, hidden beneath a ragged rug in a corner of the kitchen. It was bolted shut. The crowbar, still lying where I'd dropped it near the lighthouse entrance, was my only tool. The thudding from the tower grew louder, more insistent. Each impact sent tremors through the cottage floor. Working with frantic haste, my injured hand throbbing, I attacked the cellar bolts. They were rusted solid. Ashton's strength seemed to flow into my arms. A desperate, focused power. With a screech of tortured metal, the first bolt gave way, then the second. The cellar was a black, gaping maw, exhaling an earthy, damp odor. My phone's flashlight, already weak, barely penetrated the darkness. Ashton's memory, however, was clear. He knew every treacherous step, every crumbling stone. As I descended into the oppressive blackness, the thudding from the tower above seemed to intensify, as if the entity sensed my alternate approach. The air in the cellar was heavy, stagnant, making it difficult to breathe. Cobwebs, thick as shrouds, brushed against my face. And then I saw it, just as Ashton remembered, a low, arched opening in the far cellar wall, bricked up crudely with newer, paler stones. The sealed passage. The crowbar became an extension of my will, Ashton's will. I attacked the bricks with a ferocity born of terror and a dawning, terrible responsibility. The mortar crumbled, dust filling the air, choking me. Bricks came loose, one by one, thudding onto the damp earth. Behind the bricks, darkness. And a faint, almost imperceptible draft of cold, briny air. The passage. The thudding from the tower stopped abruptly. A new silence descended, more terrifying than the clamor. A silence that felt like a predator holding its breath, listening, waiting. It knows, the thought was a whisper in my mind, Ashton's fear mingling with my own. It's trying to trick you. Draw you in. I ignored the warning, driven by a desperate urgency. Squeezing through the narrow opening I'd created, I found myself in a cramped, low-ceilinged tunnel, the air thick with the smell of ancient stone and something else, that primordial, oceanic stench of the entity. My flashlight beam danced nervously ahead, revealing a passage that sloped gently upwards. It was barely wide enough for me to crawl. The sense of claustrophobia was immense, but the thought of what was happening in the cottage above, of that iron door failing, pushed me onward. After what felt like an eternity of scraping through the oppressive darkness, the tunnel opened into a circular space. The base of the lighthouse tower. Here, the air was electric, charged with a palpable, malevolent energy. My flashlight beam flickered and died, plunging me into absolute blackness. But then, a faint, internal luminescence began to emanate from the stone walls themselves. The ancient markings Ashton had written of. They pulsed with a dim, sickly light, intricate symbols and patterns that seemed to writhe and shift before my eyes, their geometry alien and unsettling. And they were fading. Some lines were barely visible, their power almost extinguished. This was where the seal was failing. From above, from the upper levels of the tower, came a low, triumphant chuckle, a sound that was not human, a sound that promised untold horrors. The entity was close to breaking free. My bleeding hand. Ashton's voice in my mind was urgent, almost frantic. Now, Clara. Renew the markings. Your will, your life, anchor the light. With trembling fingers, I touched my bleeding palm to the nearest fading symbol. As my blood met the ancient stone, the marking flared with renewed light, a vibrant, angry red. A wave of energy, cold and powerful, surged through me, and for a moment, I felt an immense, crushing pressure, as if the weight of the entire tower, the weight of the entity's rage, was focused solely on me. The triumphant chuckle from above turned into a shriek of fury. One by one, guided by Ashton's memory of the patterns, I traced the fading symbols with my own blood. Each renewed marking pulsed with light, pushing back the oppressive darkness. The air in the base of the tower grew less charged, the malevolent pressure easing slightly. It was a desperate, agonizing process. My hand throbbed, my head swam with dizziness, but Ashton's will, his centuries of ingrained duty, kept me going. I was no longer just Clara Holloway, grieving sister. I was a conduit, a vessel for a purpose far older and more terrible than I could have imagined. Finally, the last symbol flared to life. The base of the tower was now a circle of pulsing crimson light, a vibrant, living seal against the encroaching darkness. A deafening roar of pure, unadulterated hatred erupted from the upper levels of the tower, so powerful it made the stone beneath my feet tremble. But the crimson light held. The seal, for now, was restored. Exhausted, bleeding, and shaking uncontrollably, I sagged against the wall. Ashton's presence within me felt fainter now, not gone, but depleted. He had given so much, for so long. And now, I had taken up his terrible burden. The immediate danger had passed. But as I sat there in the pulsing crimson glow, the silence from above returned, no longer triumphant, but filled with a cold, calculating patience. It knew I was here. It knew what I had done. And it knew that seals, even those written in blood, were not eternal. My vigil at Grieve Wind Point had just begun. The last light was no longer just a beacon for ships, it was the fragile, flickering flame of my own life, pitted against an ancient darkness that would never stop trying to break free. And the crimson tide would, inevitably, rise again. Chapter 6, The Keeper's Inheritance. The days that followed the resealing of the tower blurred into a new, grim reality. The overt, violent manifestations from the entity ceased, the thudding and tearing replaced by a simmering, malevolent silence that was almost worse. It was the silence of a predator biding its time, aware of the renewed strength of its cage but already plotting its next assault. Ashton's presence within me, though depleted by the ritual, remained. It was quieter now, less emerging and more a constant, subtle companionship. His knowledge was my knowledge, his muscle memory ingrained in my movements. I found myself performing the mundane tasks of survival, tending the fire, fetching water, rationing my dwindling supplies, with an efficiency and stoicism that wasn't entirely my own. His grief for Mary still echoed within me, a phantom ache that intertwined with my own raw sorrow for Michael, creating a tapestry of shared loss that was both a burden and a strange comfort. The cottage, too, seemed to settle. The sensory imprints became less chaotic, more like faded photographs than active replays. The clinking teacups, the ghostly scent of pipe tobacco, the snatches of old sea shanties, they were still there, but they felt more distant, echoes of lives lived rather than active presences vying for attention. It was as if my act of reinforcing the seal had, in some small way, brought a measure of peace to the lesser spirits of Grievewind Point, their anxieties soothed by the containment of the greater darkness. My life became a strange duality. By day, I was Clara Holloway, a woman grappling with loss and an impossible, terrifying inheritance. I meticulously cleaned my wound, bandaged it with strips torn from an old sheet, and forced myself to eat, to maintain some semblance of physical strength. I read Ashton's logbook repeatedly, absorbing every detail, every warning, every desperate hope he'd inscribed in its brittle pages. By night, or whenever the atmosphere in the cottage grew too heavy, I became something more. I felt the weight of Ashton's watch, the centuries of vigilance. I would find myself pacing the small cottage, my senses preternaturally alert, listening for any change in the wind, any shift in the pressure from the tower. My dreams were a chaotic mix of my own memories and his, Michael's laughter mingling with the roar of phantom storms, Mary's gentle smile superimposed over the desolate seascape. The journal remained my steadfast, silent confessor. November 12th. The silence from the tower is deceptive. It's not peace, it's assessment. I can feel it, like a cold spot in the air that never quite dissipates. Ashton is quiet within me, but present. Sometimes I catch myself using his turns of phrase. He called the fog the Grey Widow. I said it aloud this morning without thinking. November 15th, supplies are running low. The satellite phone is useless, no signal since the resealing. I haven't seen another soul since the boat captain dropped me off what feels like a lifetime ago. Part of me wonders if he'll even come back. Would I, if I were him? Knowing what this place is. The world outside Grievewind Point felt impossibly distant. A half-forgotten dream. My old life, my career, my friends, they were like figures in a faded photograph. My reality had contracted to this desolate spit of land, this crumbling cottage, and the terrible secret housed in the stone tower. One afternoon, as a weak, watery sun broke through the persistent cloud cover, I felt a familiar pull, Ashton's awareness sharpening within me. He was directing my attention not to the tower, but to the sea. I went to the window, my gaze sweeping the horizon. At first, I saw nothing but the endless expanse of gray-green water. But then, a dark speck, growing steadily larger. A boat. Not the sturdy fishing vessel of the captain who had brought me here, but something smaller, sleeker, a pleasure craft, ill-suited for these treacherous coastal waters. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Ashton's anxiety mirrored my own. Fools, his thought, sharp and clear in my mind. They don't know the currents here. Don't know the teeth of the rocks. The boat was heading dangerously close to the submerged reefs that lay just off Grievewind Point, reefs that Ashton knew like the back of his own weathered hand. My hand. Without conscious thought, I was moving. Ashton's purpose propelled me. I knew what needed to be done, not to save them from the sea, that was their own folly, but to protect them from this place. The path to the lighthouse tower, the one I'd avoided since the resealing, now felt like an inevitability. I didn't try the silentium door. I scrambled back down into the cellar, through the narrow passage, and into the tower's base. The crimson marking still pulsed, albeit fainter than before. The entity above was silent, perhaps sensing new prey, new potential anchors for its influence. The spiral staircase was a dizzying ascent, each step echoing Ashton's countless journeys. The air grew colder, the sense of malevolent presence intensifying with each level. But his resolve, fused with my own desperate need to prevent others from suffering this fate, pushed me onward. When I reached the lantern room, it was as I remembered from Ashton's vision, the shattered lens, the barren space. But the internal luminescence I'd seen during my first visit, the light that had threatened to dissolve me, was gone. The room was filled only with the gray, dying light of the afternoon. The pleasure craft was closer now, perilously near the reef. I could see figures on its deck, 2 of them, oblivious to their danger. The light, Ashton's thought, was a desperate command. It must warn them. Not of the rocks. But the great lamp was a ruin, its mechanism seized, its fuel lines dry for decades. Then, I understood. The light Ashton spoke of wasn't just the physical beam. It was the intent, the focused will of the keeper, amplified by the tower's inherent energies. The light he had held against the darkness. I stood in the center of the lantern room, where the great lamp had once turned. I closed my eyes, reaching inward, drawing on the shared grief, the shared resolve, the very essence of Ashton's long vigil, and my own burgeoning, terrible understanding. I focused on the boat, on the unsuspecting souls aboard. I projected a warning, not in words, but in pure, visceral sensation: danger. Turn back. This place is death. I poured all my will, all my fear, all my sorrow into that silent, desperate plea. The air in the lantern room crackled. A faint, almost imperceptible shimmer emanated from where the lens had been, a ghost of light. My head throbbed, my vision swam. The effort was immense, draining me in a way that even the blood ritual had not. For a long moment, nothing happened. The boat continued its reckless course. Then, I saw one of the figures on deck point towards the lighthouse. They both stared. I couldn't see their faces, but I could imagine their confusion, perhaps a flicker of unease. The boat slowed, its engine noise changing. It began to turn, slowly, hesitantly at first, then with more conviction, away from the reef, away from Grievewind Point. They were leaving. Relief, so profound it left me weak-kneed, washed through me. I sagged against the rusted metal framework, gasping for breath. Ashton's presence within me felt satisfied. A quiet affirmation. As the boat became a receding speck on the horizon, I knew my role here was solidifying. I was no longer just a victim, an inheritor of sorrow. I was the keeper. Not of a physical light, perhaps, but of a warning, a boundary. The cost of this newfound purpose became terrifyingly clear that night. As darkness fell, the entity in the tower, perhaps enraged by the loss of potential new anchors, or simply sensing a shift in my own being, launched its most furious assault yet. The silentium door didn't just shudder, it buckled and tore at its hinges with horrifying force. The crimson markings in the tower's base pulsed erratically, dimming and flaring like a failing heart. The psychic pressure was immense. Horrifying images flooded my mind, not Ashton's memories, but raw, primal visions of chaos, of tearing flesh, of a vast, ancient hunger. The entity was trying to break me, to shatter my will, to make me open the door from this side. Hold, Clara. Hold the light. Ashton's voice, a desperate anchor in the storm of psychic assault. I retreated to the cellar, to the base of the tower, pressing myself against the cool stone beside the crimson markings. I didn't have the strength for another blood offering so soon. All I had was my will, Ashton's will, fused into one desperate point of resistance. I focused on the light, the ghost light I had projected earlier. I imagined it pure, unwavering, a shield against the encroaching darkness. I poured every ounce of my being into that visualization, my own grief, Michael's memory, Ashton's sorrow, Mary's love, all of it fuel for this desperate, internal flame. The battle raged for hours, a silent, terrible war fought in the depths of my own mind, mirrored by the violent assault on the iron door. Several times, I felt my resolve crumble, the darkness seeping in, the entity's voice, a seductive, sanity-shredding whisper, promising an end to pain, an end to sorrow, if I would only yield. But each time, Ashton's strength, his ingrained sense of duty, pulled me back from the brink. The light sees all, Clara. It endures. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, the assault began to wane. The psychic pressure lessened. The violent sounds from the tower subsided, replaced once more by that simmering, patient silence. I had held. We had held. But the crimson markings were noticeably dimmer. The seal had been weakened, significantly. I knew then, with a certainty that chilled me to the marrow, that this was my life now. A constant vigilance, a cycle of renewal and resistance. The captain who had brought me here would not return. He knew, on some level, what this place demanded. I was alone, bound to Grievewind Point, not by chains, but by a terrible, inherited responsibility. My grief for Michael hadn't vanished. But it had found a new, terrible context. His loss was now part of the sorrow that fueled this place, part of the sorrow I had to channel, to wield as a weapon. The lighthouse keeper's cottage was no longer a refuge. It was my battle station. And the last light was not a beacon for lost ships, but the defiant spark of human will, burning against an ancient, insatiable darkness, on a desolate coast where the tide of memory was forever crimson. Chapter 7, The Cartography of Sorrow. The rhythm of my existence at Grievewind Point became a stark, elemental dance, vigilance, decay, renewal. The entity in the tower was a constant, brooding pressure, its silences as menacing as its overt attacks. Ashton's presence, though a part of me, was a heavy cloak of borrowed duty, a constant reminder of the unending nature of this watch. I learned to read the moods of the place like an old mariner reads the sky. The way the wind shifted carried whispers of the entity's growing restlessness. The color of the sea, on certain days, seemed to reflect its cold, ancient hunger. The very stones of the cottage and lighthouse felt saturated with a sorrow so profound it was almost a physical substance. My supplies dwindled to near nothing. I learned to forage, Ashton's knowledge guiding me to edible seaweed along the tide line, to tough, bitter berries that grew in stunted bushes clinging to the cliffs. Hunger became a familiar companion, sharpening my senses, honing my resolve. There was no room for weakness here. Weakness was an invitation. The crimson markings in the tower base were a constant source of anxiety. They faded with a terrifying rapidity, especially after nights when the entity's pressure was strong. The ritual of renewal, the offering of my own blood, became a grim necessity, performed with a stoic resignation that mirrored Ashton's entries in the log. Each time, it left me weaker, paler, the boundaries of my own identity feeling a little more porous. November 28, renewed the seals. Harder this time. It fought back, in my mind. Showed me Michael, laughing, then, the crash. Tried to use my grief against me. Ashton's strength, it's what gets me through. But how much of me is left? How much is him? Does it even matter anymore? I began to understand the cartography of sorrow that Ashton had alluded to. This place wasn't just geographically isolated, it was a nexus, a point where the accumulated grief and trauma of the land and sea converged. The storms that lashed the coast weren't just weather, they were manifestations of this sorrow, feeding the entity, testing the seals. The shipwrecks Ashton had witnessed, the lives lost to the unforgiving Atlantic, their echoes lingered here, woven into the fabric of Grievewind Point. My connection to Ashton deepened beyond shared memories and skills. I began to experience his emotions with a startling immediacy. A sudden, inexplicable wave of joy would wash over me, sharp and poignant, and I'd realize it was his memory of Mary, of a moment of shared happiness before tragedy struck. Or a surge of bitter regret, so profound it would bring tears to my eyes, his regret for words unsaid, for chances not taken. It was as if our two streams of consciousness were merging, creating a new, hybrid awareness. I was Clara, mourning Michael. I was Ashton, mourning Mary, guarding the light. We were two grieving souls, bound together across time by this accursed place and its terrible duty. One particularly bleak afternoon, as a sleet-filled wind clawed at the cottage, I found myself drawn to the boarded-up window that faced the lighthouse. I had left the crowbar where it lay, but the temptation to see, to understand more, was overwhelming. Using the paring knife, slowly, carefully, I began to chip away at the old, hardened putty around one of the smaller panes of glass. It took hours, my fingers numb with cold, my injured palm aching. Finally, a small section of glass came loose. I peered through the tiny, grimy opening. The lighthouse tower stood stark and gray against the turbulent sky. And then I saw it. Or rather, felt it. A flicker, a distortion in the air around the upper levels of the tower, near the lantern room. Not a physical presence, but an aura of immense, ancient power, a visible manifestation of the entity's contained might. It was like looking at a heat haze, but cold, radiating an almost unbearable psychic pressure even from this distance. And then, for a fraction of a second, I saw a shape within the distortion. Immense, multi-limbed, with eyes that glowed with a faint, internal luminescence, not the crimson of the seals, but a sickly, phosphorescent green. It was a glimpse so fleeting, so horrifying, that my mind recoiled, refusing to fully process it. I stumbled back from the window, gasping, my heart hammering. That was what Ashton had fought. That was what the silentium door, the crimson seals, barely contained. An entity not of this world, or perhaps, an entity that was this world, in its most primal, untamed, sorrowful form. December 3rd, saw it. Through the window. Just a glimpse. But enough. It's not a ghost. It's older. Something the sea coughed up. Something the land remembers with terror. Ashton called it the grief wind. Apt. It is the grief of this place, given form. The knowledge was a crushing weight. How could one person, two intertwined souls, stand against such a thing? Yet, there was a strange strength in the shared burden. Ashton's unwavering sense of duty, his centuries of holding the line, became a bedrock for my own faltering courage. When my grief for Michael threatened to overwhelm me, to make me careless, Ashton's quiet resolve would surface, reminding me of the larger, more immediate threat. The entity, the grief wind, seemed to sense this internal reinforcement. Its tactics shifted. Instead of raw, furious assaults, it began a more insidious campaign. Whispers. Not the clear, directed whispers that had called my name, but subtle, undermining insinuations that wove themselves into my thoughts. You're alone, Clara. No one is coming. Michael wouldn't want you to suffer like this. It would be so easy to let go. Ashton failed. You will too. The tide always wins. These thoughts, laced with my own deepest fears and sorrows, were terrifyingly effective. Doubt became a constant companion. Was I strong enough? Was this sacrifice even meaningful? Or was I just another tragic figure in Grieve Windpoint's long history of loss? It was during one of these periods of intense psychic assault, huddled by the dying embers of the fire, the wind howling like a chorus of damned souls, that Ashton's presence offered a different kind of memory. Not of sorrow, or duty, but of defiance. I saw him, not in the lantern room, but on the cliff edge, during a lull in a ferocious storm. The sea was a maelstrom of black water and white foam. He stood facing it, his oilskins plastered to his frame, his gray beard wild in the wind. And he was singing. A rough, defiant sea shanty, his voice cracking but strong, hurled into the teeth of the gale. It wasn't a song of joy, but of endurance. A declaration of his refusal to be broken. The memory resonated deep within me. Defiance. That was the key. Not just passive resistance, but an active assertion of will against the overwhelming despair. The next time the grievewind's whispers tried to insinuate themselves into my mind, I fought back. I focused on Michael's laughter, not his death. I clung to the memory of Mary's smile, as Ashton had. I sang, my voice thin and wavering at first, then growing stronger, a wordless melody of grief and defiance hurled back at the darkness. The whispers faltered. The psychic pressure eased. It wasn't a victory, not by any means. It was a temporary reprieve. But it was something. December 10th. It tries to break me with sorrow. But sorrow can also be a shield, a fire. Ashton knew this. He didn't just endure, My understanding of my role was evolving. I wasn't just a keeper of seals, a conduit for Ashton's will. I was becoming a part of the cartography of sorrow myself, but not as a victim. I was learning to navigate its treacherous terrain, to use its currents, to find the small, hidden harbors of strength within the overwhelming desolation. The crimson markings in the tower base would need renewing again soon. I could feel their power waning, feel the grieve wind gathering its strength for another assault. The cycle was relentless. But this time, as I prepared for the inevitable, there was a subtle shift within me. The terror was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. But alongside it, a flicker of something new. Not hope, perhaps. That felt too fragile a word for this place. But a grim, unwavering resolve. I was Clara Holloway. I was Thomas Ashton. We were the keepers of the last light. And as long as we drew breath, as long as blood flowed in our veins, my veins, the light, however fragile, would not be extinguished. The grieve wind would not win. Not today. Chapter 8, The Solitude of Sentinels. Time at Grieve Wind Point ceased to be a linear progression and became a cyclical tide of vigilance and weariness. Seasons bled into one another, marked not by calendar dates, but by the changing fury of the storms, the subtle shifts in the entity's pressure, and the ever-present ache in my hand from the recurring ritual of renewal. My reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror became a stranger's face, gaunt. Weathered, eyes that held an old, haunted knowledge. It was Clara's face, yes, but etched with Ashton's enduring watch. The outside world, the one with cities and people and lives not dictated by ancient sorrows, receded further into the realm of myth. Sometimes, during the brief, fragile lulls when the grieve wind was quiescent and Ashton's presence was a gentle hum rather than an urgent command, I would try to remember Michael's face clearly. The details, once so sharp, were beginning to soften, to blur, like a photograph left too long in the sun. It was a new kind of grief, the fear of forgetting, and it fueled my defiance against the entity with a fresh, bitter anger. January 5th. The winter storms are relentless. The grieve wind draws strength from them. Renewed the seals last night. It was harder. The entity's whispers were cleverer, mimicking Michael's voice, Mary's. Ashton's memory of her love, his refusal to let that be corrupted, was the only thing that kept me from faltering. I feel thin. Stretched. Like old canvas. My connection with Ashton deepened into something beyond shared consciousness. It was a silent understanding, a partnership forged in shared trauma and unyielding purpose. His practical skills were now second nature to me. I could mend fishing nets I had no memory of learning to use, navigate the treacherous cliff paths in near darkness, predict the turn of the tide with uncanny accuracy. His stoicism became my shield, his endurance my bedrock. But the solitude was a beast of its own. Even with Ashton's constant presence within me, a profound loneliness settled in my bones. He was a ghost, a memory, however vivid. I was the living, breathing anchor, the one who felt the sting of the wind, the gnawing hunger, the chilling touch of my own blood on the ancient stones. There was no one to share the burden, no one to witness the silent, terrible war I waged. Sometimes, I would talk to Ashton, not just in my mind, but aloud. My voice would echo strangely in the small cottage, his faint, internal responses a counterpoint to my spoken words. Do you think they're safe, Thomas? I'd ask, staring out at the churning sea after warding off another unseen vessel with the ghost light. The ones we turn away. For now, Clara. For now. His mental reply would be tinged with a weariness that transcended centuries. But the sea always calls. And this place always listens. The grieve wind, too, seemed to adapt to my growing resilience. Its direct psychic assaults became less frequent, replaced by a more insidious form of pressure. It began to play with the fabric of reality within the cottage, subtle distortions designed to unnerve, to make me doubt my own sanity. Objects would move, not violently, but with a quiet, deliberate malevolence. The logbook, left on the table, would be found on the mantel. A cup, carefully placed, would appear on the floor. Sometimes, the replays of the past would stutter, loop, or blend with the present in disorienting ways, leaving me unsure of what was real and what was echo. One morning, I woke to find the entire living room rearranged. The table and chairs were pressed against the far wall, the armchair overturned, Ashton's photograph lying face down on the floor. There was no sign of forced entry, no sound of disturbance. Just the silent, mocking alteration of my small, familiar space. January 22nd. It's trying to unmoor me. To make me question what is real. Ashton says it did this to him too, in the later years. Small madnesses. The erosion of certainty. He fought it by focusing on the constants, the rhythm of the light, the turn of the tides, the names of the stars. I have only the tides and the wind. And the memory of his light. My defiance took new forms. I began to tend the small, neglected patch of earth behind the cottage, coaxing a few hardy herbs from the salty soil, Ashton's forgotten gardening knowledge surfacing unexpectedly. The simple act of nurturing life, however small, felt like a rebellion against the decay and sorrow that permeated Grieve Wind Point. I would read aloud from the few tattered books I'd found, Shakespeare, a collection of maritime poetry. My voice a deliberate challenge to the oppressive silence, Ashton's presence a silent, appreciative audience. The bond between us was the one thing the Grieve Wind couldn't seem to touch, couldn't corrupt. It could mimic our loved ones, exploit our grief, but the shared purpose, the fusion of our wills, seemed to create a shield it could not penetrate. One blustery March evening, as I was preparing for another renewal of the seals, the crimson markings in the tower base were fading with alarming speed, a new kind of imprint manifested. It wasn't a sensory echo or a replay of Ashton's past. It was a feeling, a sudden, inexplicable surge of hope. It was so alien, so out of place in the constant dread and sorrow of Grieve Wind Point, that it startled me. The hope wasn't mine. It wasn't even Ashton's usual weary resolve. It felt younger. Brighter. Then came the sound. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A child's laughter. It seemed to emanate from the direction of the cliffs, carried on the wind. My heart lurched. There were no children here. There hadn't been for generations, if ever. A trick, Ashton's thought was immediate, sharp with warning. It's trying a new lure. But the laughter, impossibly, felt real. It tugged at something deep within me, something that ached for innocence, for a life untouched by this darkness. Against Ashton's urgent mental protests, I found myself moving towards the cottage door. The wind howled, snatching at my clothes. The sea roared below. And through it all, that faint, crystalline laughter. I stepped out onto the cliff path. The air was biting, filled with salt spray. The laughter seemed to dance just ahead, leading me towards the precipice. Clara, no. It's a glamour, a falsehood. Ashton's voice was desperate in my mind. But the sound was so sweet, so pure. It reminded me of Michael, of a time before the silence, before the world tilted. As I neared the cliff edge, the laughter grew louder, closer. And then I saw it. Not a child. But a shimmering, ethereal light, hovering just beyond the cliff, over the churning waves. It pulsed gently, the laughter seeming to emanate from its core. It was beautiful, captivating, promising. What? Escape? Peace? Look closer, Clara. See what it truly is. Ashton's will, fierce and protective, surged through me, sharpening my senses, cutting through the illusion. I forced myself to focus, to see beyond the alluring light. And as I did, the glamour wavered. The beautiful shimmer resolved into something else. The light was the sickly, phosphorescent green of the grievewind's eyes. The laughter, when listened to with Ashton's grim understanding, was not joyful, but mocking, predatory. It was the sound of a trap being sprung. The entity wasn't just trying to break the seals anymore. It was trying to lure me, its keeper, into its own domain, into the sorrowful, chaotic depths from which it had sprung. With a gasp, I stumbled back from the cliff edge, the illusion shattering completely, leaving only the howling wind and the crashing waves. The green light winked out, the mocking laughter fading into the storm. Shaken, but resolute, I turned back towards the cottage, towards the tower. The seals needed renewing. The watch had to be kept. March 19th. It tried to lure me over the cliffs. Used the sound of a child. The hope I felt, that was the bait. Ashton saved me. His experience, his knowledge of its tricks. We are two sentinels, he and I, bound to this rock, this light. And the solitude, it is the price. But we are not alone in it. We have each other, in this strange, timeless way. The grieve wind would not rest. It would always seek a way out, a way to spread its ancient sorrow. But now, it faced not one keeper, but two, their griefs and strengths intertwined, a shared defiance against the encroaching tide. The last light still burned, a fragile, precious flame in the heart of an unending storm. And as long as it did, the boundary would hold. The solitude of sentinels was a heavy burden, but it was a burden we would bear together, for as long as time, or grieve wind point, allowed. Chapter 9, The Cartographer's Duty. The failed luring attempt seemed to mark a shift in the grieve-wind strategy. The overt psychic assaults lessened, the deceptive glamours ceased. Instead, a deeper, more pervasive sense of despair began to emanate from the tower, a cold, crushing weight that sought to extinguish not just my will, but my very hope of endurance. It was a siege of attrition, designed to wear me down, to make the endless cycle of vigilance and renewal feel utterly futile. Ashton's presence, though a constant source of strength, also became a conduit for this deeper despair. I felt the echoes of his own long years of solitude, the slow erosion of his hope, the crushing weight of a responsibility that offered no respite, no end. His defiance had been a shield, but even shields could crack under relentless pressure. April 10th. The despair is a physical thing. It settles in my bones, makes my limbs heavy. Ashton feels it too. His mental voice is quieter, tinged with a weariness that frightens me. He whispers of the long watch, of the fading of the light within. Is this how he finally succumbed? Not to a direct attack, but to the slow, inexorable grind of hopelessness. My small acts of defiance, tending the herb garden, reading aloud, singing into the wind, felt increasingly hollow. The herbs struggled in the salty soil, their growth stunted. My voice cracked when I tried to sing, the melodies dissolving into the vast, indifferent silence of the coast. Even the companionship of Ashton's consciousness felt like a shared cell rather than a fortified bastion. The crimson markings in the tower base demanded renewal with increasing frequency. The grieve wind was learning, adapting, finding new ways to drain their power. Each bloodletting left me weaker, more spectral. I caught myself staring at my hands, at their growing translucence, wondering how much longer I could sustain the physical cost. One particularly grim twilight, as I was forcing down a meager meal of dried seaweed and hoarded ship's biscuit, a taste Ashton remembered with a grimace, a new kind of imprint manifested. It wasn't a memory, or a sensory echo. It was a map. It appeared not in my mind, but on the dusty surface of the cottage table, traced and faint, glowing lines of the same sickly green as the Grievewind's eyes. It was a map of Grievewind Point, but not as any human cartographer would draw it. This map showed lines of power, currents of sorrow, flowing across the land and sea, converging on the lighthouse like ley lines of despair. It showed the wound Ashton had spoken of, a pulsating nexus of darkness directly beneath the tower. And it showed other points, smaller, fainter, scattered along the coastline for miles in either direction. Other wounds. Other places where the veil between worlds was thin. As I stared at this impossible, terrifying cartography, Ashton's understanding flooded my mind. It's not just here, Clara. This place, it's the heart. But the sickness spreads. It has always spread, in small ways. Other keepers, other lights, they fought their own battles, held their own small lines. The Grievewind wasn't just a localized entity. It was a symptom of a larger, more ancient malaise, a sorrow inherent in the very fabric of this desolate coast. The lighthouse, my lighthouse, was the primary bulwark, the critical seal, but it was not the only one. And then, the glowing green map on the table shifted. One of the smaller, distant points of light began to flicker erratically, then dimmed, almost to extinction. A wave of psychic distress, cold and sharp, lanced through me, not from Ashton, not from the Grievewind, but from somewhere else. Somewhere distant. Another light is failing, Ashton's thought was grim. Another keeper, lost. Or perhaps, there is no keeper there anymore. The implications were staggering. My duty, Ashton's duty, wasn't just to this single point. The failure of other, smaller seals, would inevitably increase the pressure on Grievewind Point, making my task exponentially harder. The entity in the tower would draw strength from these breaches, its influence spreading like a stain. A new, desperate urgency filled me. I couldn't leave Grievewind Point. My physical presence, my blood, was tied to this seal. But perhaps there was something else I could do. Ashton's memories, his knowledge of the coast, of the old ways, offered a glimmer of an idea. He remembered tales from other, older keepers, passed down through generations, tales of sympathetic magic, of focused intent projected across distances, of reinforcing distant wards through a central, anchored consciousness. It was a desperate, almost mythical concept, but in this place where the rules of reality were so fluid, it felt like the only option. April 18th. A distant seal is failing. I felt it. Ashton knew of ways to send strength. Not a physical journey, but a projection. A sharing of the burden. The cartography of sorrow shows the connections. If I can trace them, perhaps I can reinforce them. The task was monumental, perhaps impossible. It would require an even deeper merging with Ashton, a more profound channeling of our combined will. And it would undoubtedly draw the Grievewind's attention, its fury. But the thought of another soul, another keeper, succumbing to the darkness, of the entity's influence spreading unchecked, was unbearable. My grief for Michael, Ashton's grief for Mary, it all coalesced into a fierce, protective empathy for these unknown, distant sentinels. That night, I didn't wait for the crimson markings to fade. I descended into the tower base, the air already thick with the Grievewind's simmering rage. It knew what I was attempting. It fought me with a barrage of despairing whispers, with visions of Michael's mangled car, of Mary's wasting illness. But this time, I had a new focus. I wasn't just defending, I was reaching out. I renewed the seals at Grievewind Point first, the familiar sting of the blade, the flare of crimson light, the entity's furious howl. Then, with my blood still fresh on my hands, I turned my focus to the glowing green map that was now seared into my mind's eye. I located the flickering, dying point of light, miles down the coast. Closing my eyes, I drew on every ounce of Ashton's knowledge, every fiber of my own desperate will. I imagined our combined essence, our shared sorrow, our defiant light, flowing out from Grievewind Point, following the luminous lines of the sorrow map, towards that distant, failing seal. It was like trying to hold back the ocean with my bare hands. The effort was unimaginable. My consciousness stretched, thinned, threatened to tear. I felt the grieve wind's fury like a physical blow, trying to sever the connection, trying to pull me back into its despair. Hold, Clara. Hold as I held. Ashton's voice, a raw, desperate shout in the cacophony of my mind. I clung to the image of that distant, flickering light. I poured my grief, my love, my defiance into the projection. I felt a part of myself, a significant part, flow outwards, leaving me feeling hollowed out, dangerously depleted. Then, in the map within my mind, the distant light flared. It didn't return to full strength, but it stabilized. The flickering ceased. A faint, almost imperceptible pulse of gratitude, of shared struggle, echoed back along the sorrow line. I collapsed against the tower wall, gasping, my vision graying at the edges. The cost had been immense. I felt more translucent than ever, my own physical form feeling like a fragile suggestion. But the distant seal had held. April 19th. It worked. We reinforced a distant ward. The cost. I feel like a ghost myself. Ashton is proud. But he is also afraid. He says this new duty, it will consume me faster. The grieve wind knows now that I can reach beyond this point. It will not forgive this. The cartographer's duty. That's what it felt like. I was no longer just a keeper of a single point, but a tender of a vast, unseen network of sorrow and resilience. My solitude was no less profound, but my purpose had expanded. Become even more terrifyingly vital. The grieve wind's silence in the following days was deeper, colder, more calculating than ever before. It was gathering its strength, assessing this new dimension of our conflict. I knew the next assault would be different. It would be aimed not just at breaking the seals of Grieve Wind Point, but at severing these fragile connections I was now trying to forge, at extinguishing not just my light, but the faint, scattered lights of all the other sentinels along this desolate, sorrow-haunted coast. My own grief for Michael, which had once been a consuming fire, now felt like a single, precious ember, one I had to guard carefully, for it was part of the fuel that kept all the other lights burning. The last light was no longer just mine, or Ashton's. It belonged to all of us, the forgotten keepers, the cartographers of sorrow, standing sentinel against an ancient, unending tide. And the map of that sorrow was now etched not just on a dusty table, but onto my very soul. Chapter 10, The Chorus of Lost Lights. The Grieve Wind's retribution was not long in coming. It began not with a direct assault on the tower, but with a subtle, insidious unraveling of the very fabric of Grieve Wind Point. The air grew heavier, imbued with a despair so thick it felt like wading through chilled molasses. The already muted colors of the landscape seemed to fade further, leaching into a monochrome of grays and muted blues. Even the roar of the sea sounded different, less a natural force and more a mournful, unending sigh. Ashton's presence within me grew agitated, his usual stoicism fractured by a new, sharper anxiety. It's reaching for them, Clara. The other lights. Trying to sever your threads before they can truly bind. The mental map of sorrow, once a clear, albeit terrifying, guide in my mind, began to waver. The luminous lines connecting Grieve Wind Point to the distant, smaller seals flickered erratically, like faulty wiring. The points of light themselves, which had pulsed with a faint, steady rhythm after my reinforcement, now pulsed with a desperate, panicked beat. I felt their fear, their struggle, as if it were my own. A chorus of distant, silent screams echoed along the sorrow lines, a cacophony of fading hope. My attempts to project strength, to reinforce those distant wards, became a desperate, draining battle. Each time I reached out, the Grieve Wind met my efforts with a wave of crushing despair, a psychic interference that sought to overwhelm my will and sever the fragile connections. It was like trying to shout encouragement across a raging battlefield while being simultaneously deafened by cannon fire. May 2nd. 2 more lights are flickering badly. One, to the north, feels almost gone. I projected, but the connection is weak, like trying to transmit through thick fog. The grieve wind is learning. It's isolating us. Picking us off, one by one. The physical toll on me was immense. The renewals of the grieve wind point seals were more frequent, more draining. My blood felt thin, my body insubstantial. Sleep was a torment of fractured visions, failing lighthouses, desperate, shadowy figures swallowed by an encroaching darkness, the triumphant, sickly green glow of the grieve wind's eyes. One night, as I huddled in the tower base, tracing the crimson patterns with a hand that felt like brittle parchment, I heard a new sound from above. Not the familiar rage of the entity, but something different. A chorus of whispers. Dozens of voices, faint and ethereal, yet undeniably present, seemed to swirl around the upper levels of the tower. They were not the focused, sentient whispers of the grieve wind, nor the distinct echoes of past keepers I'd grown accustomed to. These were lost. Confused. Filled with a babble of fear and regret. Ashton's recognition was immediate, chilling. The keepers, from the failing lights. Their consciousness, it's being drawn here. To the heart. The grieve wind is collecting them. The tower was becoming a spiritual magnet, pulling in the fading essences of those other sentinels whose wards had broken. Their despair, their terror, was now added to the already oppressive atmosphere of Grieve Wind Point. Feeding the entity, strengthening its hold. The crimson seals around me pulsed weakly, struggling against this new influx of negative energy. I could feel their power diminishing, even as I renewed them. May 10th. They're here. The lost lights. I can hear them in the tower. A chorus of ghosts. Ashton says the grieve wind will try to use them against me, turn their sorrow into a weapon. I feel surrounded. Utterly alone, yet horribly crowded. The grieve wind did indeed try to use them. The whispers from the lost keepers began to seep into my consciousness, not with the insidious intent of the entity, but with a raw, unfiltered agony that was almost unbearable. I felt their individual regrets, their final moments of terror as their own seals failed, their despair at being consumed by the darkness they had fought for so long. It was a torment of empathy, a thousandfold amplification of my own grief and Ashton's. The urge to surrender, to simply let the tide of sorrow wash over me and extinguish my own fragile light, was overwhelming. No, Clara. Ashton's voice, though strained, cut through the chorus of despair. Their light is not extinguished, merely scattered. They are not your enemy. They are us. Before the fall. His words sparked a desperate, audacious idea. If their consciousness was here, within the tower, perhaps they weren't entirely lost. Perhaps, if I could reach them, connect with them, not just as a cartographer reinforcing distant points, but as a fellow keeper. The next time I renewed the seals, I did something different. As my blood touched the ancient stones, as the crimson light flared, I didn't just focus on holding back the grieve wind. I projected outwards, upwards, into the swirling chorus of lost voices within the tower. I sent not just strength, but recognition. I see you. I hear you. You are not alone. I projected Ashton's enduring watch, his centuries of defiance. I projected my own grief for Michael, raw and unvarnished, a shared pain. I projected the memory of the pleasure craft turning away, the small victory of a warning heeded. It was like casting a single candle into a hurricane. The chorus of despairing whispers faltered, then swelled again, confused, agitated. But then, a single voice, clearer than the others, emerged from the cacophony. A woman's voice, thin and reedy, but with an undertone of steel. Who calls? Another voice joined hers, a man's, rough and uncertain. The light. I remember the light. More voices, hesitant at first, then growing stronger, a fragile countermelody to the grieve wind's oppressive silence. They were responding. They were remembering. The grieve wind reacted with incandescent fury. A wave of pure, concentrated malevolence slammed down from the upper tower, trying to crush this burgeoning connection. The crimson seals flared and dimmed violently. The cottage itself seemed to groan under the psychic pressure. But the chorus of lost lights, now bolstered by my own focused intent and Ashton's unwavering presence, held. They began to add their own faint, spectral energies to the seals, 1,000 tiny threads reinforcing the crimson weave. It wasn't enough to completely repel the grieve wind. Its power was too vast, too ancient. But it was enough to create a stalemate. The entity's focused rage was diffused, met not just by one keeper, but by a ghostly choir of defiance. May 21st. I reached them. The lost lights. They are with us now, Ashton and I. A chorus of sentinels. Their combined sorrow is immense, but so is their collective will to resist. The grieve wind is contained. For now. But it is angrier than I have ever felt it. It knows we are no longer just two. My role had shifted again. I was not just a keeper, not just a cartographer. I was a conductor, an anchor for a chorus of lost souls, their combined light a fragile bulwark against an overwhelming darkness. The solitude remained, a physical ache. But I was no longer entirely alone in my watch. Ashton was beside me, within me. And now, the faint, ethereal voices of countless other keepers, their sorrows and strengths mingling with mine, echoed through the stones of Grieve Wind Point. The cost was immeasurable. My own identity was a flickering flame, constantly threatened by the sheer volume of other consciousnesses I now carried. My physical form was a wisp, sustained only by sheer will and the grim necessity of the blood rituals. But the light, our light, held. The Grieve Wind, thwarted in its attempt to isolate and consume, retreated into a deeper, more menacing silence. It was regrouping, undoubtedly preparing a new, more devastating assault. The battle for Grieve Wind Point, for the scattered lights along the sorrow-haunted coast, was far from over. It was, perhaps, only just beginning its true, terrible chapter. And I, Clara Holloway, the grieving woman who had sought only to reprogram herself, was now at the heart of it all, the conductor of a ghostly chorus, keeper of the last, most desperate light, Chapter 11, the unending watch. The stalemate was a fragile, breathless thing. The Grieve Wind, contained but not defeated, pulsed with a cold, calculating fury from the upper tower. Its silence was no longer patient, it was the coiled stillness of a serpent about to strike. The chorus of lost lights, anchored by my will and Ashton's enduring presence, hummed with a collective, ghostly energy, a constant thrum beneath the roar of the sea and the shriek of the wind. My existence became a ceaseless act of balance. I was the fulcrum, the point where the immense sorrow of the lost keepers met the insatiable hunger of the Grieve Wind. The blood rituals were a constant drain, my physical form growing ever more translucent, my connection to the mundane world severed almost completely. Food was an afterthought, sleep a fleeting respite filled with the whispers of the chorus and the chilling pressure of the entity. Ashton was a constant, his essence so deeply intertwined with mine that the boundaries between us were all but gone. We were one consciousness, two grieving souls fused into a single, weary sentinel. His memories were my memories, his duty my own. The love for Mary, the loss of Michael, they were indistinguishable sorrows, fueling the same defiant fire. June 10th. The Grieve Wind is changing. It's not attacking the seals directly. It's seeping. Trying to find cracks, not in the stone, but in. The cartography of sorrow in my mind was no longer just lines of connection, it was a living tapestry of shared consciousness. I could feel the distant struggles of other, unknown keepers, their small lights flaring and dimming across the desolate coast. Sometimes, our combined projection of strength would reach them, steadying their flickering flames. Other times, a light would extinguish, and a new, sorrowful voice would join the chorus in our tower, their despair adding to the weight we all bore. My world had shrunk to this single, terrible point on the map, yet my awareness had expanded to encompass a vast, unseen network of suffering and resistance. The final assault, when it came, was not heralded by roars or tremors. It began with a profound, unnatural stillness. The wind died. The sea flattened into a sheet of oily black glass. The chorus of lost lights fell silent, their ethereal hum extinguished, replaced by a chilling, individual terror that resonated through me. "It's here," Ashton's thought was a cold sliver of dread. "It's found a way." The grieve wind wasn't trying to break out. It was trying to pull us in. All of us. The pressure from the tower became unbearable, a psychic vortex threatening to suck the very consciousness from my body, from Ashton, from every lost light tethered to me. The crimson seals in the tower base flared with a desperate, dying intensity, then began to dim, one by one, as if starved of their power. Visions flooded my mind, not memories, but raw, primal manifestations of the grieve wind's essence. I saw oceans of sorrow, galaxies of despair, the birth and death of worlds fueled by an ancient, insatiable hunger. It showed me the futility of resistance, the inevitability of its victory. It offered an end to the struggle, emerging with its vast, timeless being, oblivion disguised as peace. The chorus of lost lights was crumbling. I could feel their individual wills breaking, their sorrows overwhelming them. Their faint lights being drawn towards the sickly green luminescence that now seemed to fill the entire tower. "Clara. I can't." Ashton's voice, for the first time, was filled with a despair that mirrored the entity's. His own long watch, his centuries of defiance, were reaching their limit. My own strength was gone. My physical form was little more than a shimmering outline. The blood rituals had taken their toll. The last light, our last light, was guttering, about to be extinguished. And in that moment of utter desolation, as the abyss of the grieve wind's hunger yawned before me, a single, unexpected image pierced through the despair. Michael. Not the policeman's call, not the mangled car, but Michael as a boy, laughing, his face alight with pure, unadulterated joy as he chased seagulls on a sun-drenched beach. A memory so bright, so fiercely alive, it burned through the encroaching darkness. It wasn't sorrow that fueled it. It was love. A love that predated the grief, a love that was the source of the grief. And with that love, came a clarity. The grieve wind fed on sorrow, on despair. But love was anathema to it. Love was creation, not consumption. Love was light, pure and untainted. A new strength, not born of duty or defiance, but of that fierce, protective love, surged through me. It wasn't just my love for Michael. It was Ashton's love for Mary. It was the love each of the lost keepers had felt for someone, for something, before their lights had been scattered. The light, Thomas. I projected, not just to him, but to the crumbling chorus. Not the sorrow. My own spectral form began to glow, not with the crimson of the seals, but with a soft, golden radiance. Ashton's presence within me flared, his despair momentarily burned away by this new, unexpected fire. The chorus of lost lights, teetering on the brink of oblivion, paused. A few faint, golden sparks began to flicker among them. The grieve wind recoiled. The sickly green luminescence that filled the tower dimmed, as if burned by this new, unfamiliar energy. Its psychic assault faltered, its whispers turning into shrieks of confusion and rage. This was the cartographer's true duty. Not just to map sorrow, but to find the wellsprings of love that lay hidden beneath it. With every ounce of my being, I focused that golden light, pouring it into the failing seals, into the wavering consciousness of the lost keepers. It wasn't a battle of strength against strength, but of light against a darkness that could not comprehend it. The crimson markings in the tower base, touched by this golden radiance, flared with an intensity one had never witnessed, burning with a pure, unwavering flame. The silentium door, which had been on the verge of collapse, shuddered and held, its iron surface glowing faintly. The chorus of lost lights, no longer just spectral echoes but imbued with this new warmth, began to hum, a melody not of sorrow, but of a fragile, dawning hope. Their individual lights, once faint and scattered, now pulsed with a soft, golden hue, joining mine, joining Ashton's. The grieve wind let out a final, deafening roar of thwarted agony, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. Then, its presence began to recede, to withdraw, not defeated, but repelled. The oppressive weight lifted. The sickly green luminescence faded from the tower, leaving behind only the steady, golden glow of our combined light. Silence fell upon Grievewind Point. But it was a new silence. Not the silence of despair, or of a predator waiting. It was the silence of a long, terrible storm finally breaking. I stood in the tower base, or what was left of me, a shimmering confluence of golden light. Ashton was there, his essence a steady, warm presence. The chorus of lost keepers hummed around us, their individual sorrows not erased, but transmuted, their lights now part of a larger, resilient constellation. The Grievewind was still there, in the depths, in the wound. It would always be there. But it was contained, held back not just by blood and ancient ritual, but by a love that had refused to be extinguished by grief. My watch at Grievewind Point was not over. It would never be over. The seals would always need tending, the darkness would always press at the boundaries. But I was no longer alone. We were the keepers now, a chorus of last lights, our sorrow our strength, our love our shield. The reprogramming I had sought had happened, though not in any way I could have imagined. I had been rewritten, not by solitude, but by shared sacrifice, by a love that transcended time and death. Grievewind Point remained a place of sorrow, a scar on the edge of the world. But now, it was also a place of enduring light. A testament to the quiet, unbreakable strength found not in the absence of grief, but in the fierce, unwavering love that lay at its heart. The tide would always ebb and flow, but the light, our light, would hold. The last light. And all the lights that came before, and all that might yet come to share the unending watch. Story 2. Signal at 4:12. Chapter 1, The Box on the Moor. The ink on the divorce papers still felt wet, metaphorically speaking, though it had been 6 months since Clara had swept out of my life, taking with her the comfortable contours of our shared existence and leaving behind a silence that roared louder than any argument we'd ever had. 55. An age where a man ought to be settling into the comfortable armchair of his life, not being ejected from it like a stone from a catapult. The London studio, once a shared dream, now felt like a mausoleum of U.S., every familiar object a tiny, sharp reminder. I needed out. Not just out of the studio, but out of the city, out of the life that had crumbled. My art, my abstract canvases that had always been my truest solace, had become stagnant, choked by the dust of a failed marriage. I needed air, raw and untamed. I needed a place where the only ghosts were my own, or better yet, none at all. That's how I found myself, 3 weeks later, standing before the Low Moor signal box. It squatted on a slight rise overlooking a disused stretch of railway line, a brick and timber relic against the vast, bruised sky of the Yorkshire moors. The estate agent, a ruddy-faced man named Henderson whose enthusiasm seemed inversely proportional to the property's appeal, had called it a unique fixer-upper with unparalleled panoramic views. He'd failed to mention the panoramic wind that threatened to tear the hat from my head, or the way the silence, when the wind paused, seemed to press in with an almost physical weight. The signal box was a 2-story affair. The ground floor, brick-built and sturdy, had likely housed the mechanisms and perhaps a small stove. A steep, narrow wooden staircase, perilously worn, led to the upper room, the operational heart of the box. This upper chamber was predominantly timber-framed, with large, grime-streaked windows on 3 sides offering those panoramic views, miles of undulating heather, punctuated by grey stone outcrops and the occasional, wind-tortured tree. The fourth wall, facing what would have been the main line, was more solid, but even there, a smaller window looked out onto the empty track bed, now a rutted path disappearing into the distance. Needs a bit of love, Mr. Davies, but she's got character, hasn't she? Henderson had boomed, slapping a peeling timber support with a hand that could fell an ox. Character. Yes, it had that. The kind of character that spoke of abandonment and long, lonely vigils. The paint, once a proud railway brown and cream, was flaking like sunburnt skin, revealing weathered gray wood beneath. The iron levers in the upper room, a magnificent bank of them, their handles polished smooth by countless hands, were rusted solid in various positions, silent sentinels of a forgotten industry. The air inside was thick with the scent of damp, decay, and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible metallic tang, like old tools left out in the rain. Structurally sound, mostly, Henderson had assured me. Councils approved it for residential conversion, conditional on sympathetic restoration, of course. Got water and electrics run to the boundary, just needs connecting. The price was, frankly, ludicrously low. Low enough to make me suspicious, then low enough to make me ignore that suspicion. It was perfect. Isolated. Unique. A blank canvas, in its own way, onto which I could project a new life. I could see it already, the upper room, my studio, light flooding in, once the windows were cleaned or replaced, the vastness of the moors my only audience. The ground floor, a compact living space. A challenge, certainly, but I needed a challenge that wasn't emotional, one I could tackle with my hands, with paint, with sheer bloody-mindedness. Clara had always hated my impulsiveness. "Arthur, you leap before you look," she'd sighed, countless times. This, I supposed, was the biggest leap yet. I bought it. The paperwork was surprisingly swift. Within a fortnight, I was back, this time with a battered Land Rover packed with tools, cleaning supplies, a camp bed, and enough tinned food to survive a small siege. The nearest village, Haverskill, was a good 5 miles away, a scattering of stone cottages around a pub and a general store. Close enough for essentials, far enough for solitude. My first night in the Lowmore signal box was an exercise in grim determination. The wind howled around the upper story like a hungry wolf, rattling the ill-fitting window frames. I'd managed to clear a space on the ground floor, laid down my camp bed, and huddled in a sleeping bag, the single bare bulb I'd rigged up casting long, dancing shadows. Every creak of the old structure, every skittering sound from outside, a loose stone, a nocturnal animal, made me jump. The silence between the gusts was profound, unnerving. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of the blood pulsing in your own ears. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity, the stark contrast to the constant urban thrum I was used to. This was what I wanted, wasn't it? Peace. Quiet. A space to breathe, to think, to simply be. Eventually, exhaustion won. I drifted into a troubled sleep, dreams flitting like moths, Clara's disapproving frown, the endless, accusing points of railway tracks, the stark, empty horizon of the moor. Sometime in the deepest hour of the night, a sound pricked through the fog of sleep. A sharp, metallic clang. I sat bolt upright, heart hammering. The wind had died down to a mournful sigh. The silence that followed the clang was absolute. I strained my ears, listening. Nothing. Just the faint, rhythmic tick of my own wristwatch on the makeshift crate I was using as a bedside table. Must have been the wind after all, I reasoned, shifting a loose piece of guttering or something on the roof. Or perhaps an animal, a sheep bumping against the brickwork. The moors were full of them. I lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag tighter around me, but sleep was more elusive now. The image of the rusted levers upstairs, frozen in their silent configuration, came to mind. The clang had sounded like metal on metal. Heavy metal. I eventually drifted off again, but the sound, or the memory of it, lingered at the edge of my awareness, a tiny, discordant note in the symphony of my new, isolated life. It was, I told myself firmly as the gray dawn finally seeped through the grimy downstairs window, just the old box settling. Nothing more. The next few days were a blur of activity. I attacked the grime with a vengeance, scrubbing floors, washing down walls, prizing open windows that had been sealed shut for decades. The ground floor, with its low ceiling and small windows, was destined to be the living quarters. I planned a small kitchenette in one corner, a compact shower room in another, and a combined living/sleeping area. It would be Spartan, but functional. The real prize was the upper room. After 2 days of battling cobwebs the size of dinner plates and layers of dust that felt almost geological, I began to see its potential. The light, even through the dirty glass, was extraordinary, constantly shifting with the moorland weather. I lugged my painting supplies up the narrow, creaking stairs, canvases, easels, boxes of oils and acrylics, brushes of every size. The thought of setting up my easel there, of letting the wild landscape seep into my work, was a powerful motivator. The levers dominated one side of the room. There were perhaps 20 of them, painted in faded reds, blues, and blacks, their polished steel handles dulled with a fine layer of rust. Beneath them, a complex array of now disconnected rods and wires disappeared into the floor. I ran a hand over one of an ivory-colored handle, the metal surprisingly cold. For a moment, I imagined the strength it would have taken to shift it, the responsibility of holding lives in your hand with each pull and push. It was as I was contemplating this that I first noticed the smell. Not the pervasive damp and dust, but something sharper, more industrial. A faint, almost ghostly scent of coal smoke, the kind that used to hang heavy in the air of every railway station in my youth. And beneath it, a cleaner, more penetrating aroma, machine oil. I sniffed the air, puzzled. There was no fireplace here, no engine. The tracks outside were long dead. I walked around the room, trying to pinpoint the source. It seemed strongest near the bank of levers, then faded as I moved away. Strange. Perhaps it was just ingrained in the wood, I mused, the olfactory signature of the box's past life. Decades of coal-fired locomotives chuffing past, the regular oiling of the complex mechanisms, it made a kind of sense. Dismissing it, I turned my attention to the floor. The boards were thick, dark wood, scarred and stained from years of use. As I swept, I noticed something peculiar in the dust near the levers, close to where the signalman would have stood. Faint outlines, like the impressions left by boots. Not my boots, these were larger, heavier, with a distinct heel shape. I frowned, brushing at them with my hand. They were just dust patterns, surely, illusions created by the play of light and shadow on the uneven floorboards. I'd been working hard, my eyes were tired. That evening, as I ate a solitary meal of tinned stew, huddled by a small electric heater I'd bought in Haverskill, I tried to focus on the positives. The progress I was making. The sheer, unadulterated freedom of the place. But as darkness fell, cloaking the signal box in an impenetrable blackness, the unease returned. The wind picked up again, and with it, the unsettling symphony of an old building groaning under pressure. I went to bed early, exhausted. I told myself I would sleep soundly. And then, it came. Clang. Clear. Sharp. Unmistakable. Metal striking metal. My eyes snapped open. The luminous hands of my watch read 4:12 a.m. Exactly. Chapter 2, Echoes in the Iron. The clang at 4:12 a.m. It wasn't a dream. It was as real as the cold sweat that pricked my skin, as tangible as the frantic thumping of my own heart against my ribs. This time, there was no immediate dismissal, no easy rationalization. The wind was a low moan, not the violent gust needed to shift anything substantial enough to create such a sound. I lay there for a full minute, frozen, straining my ears against the oppressive silence that followed. Nothing. Just the creak of the timber frame settling around me, a sound I was beginning to learn, to catalog. That clang, though, that was an intruder, an alien note in the building's nocturnal vocabulary. Throwing off the sleeping bag, I grabbed the heavy iron poker I'd salvaged from a rusty grate downstairs, my hand surprisingly steady. If it was someone, some opportunistic thief or local yob thinking the old box was ripe for vandalism, they'd find me less than welcoming. I crept to the foot of the narrow staircase. "Hello." I called out, my voice raspy. "Is anyone up there?" Only the echo of my own words answered, swallowed by the shadows of the upper room. Taking a deep breath, I ascended, each step a loud pronouncement in the stillness. The poker felt cold and reassuring in my grip. The upper room was cast in the pre-dawn gloom, the faint light from the moorland sky silhouetting the bank of levers, making them look like skeletal figures hunched and waiting. Nothing. No sign of entry. The windows were closed, the door at the top of the external wooden steps, long since boarded up from the inside by a previous, cautious owner, and now further secured by my own recent efforts, was undisturbed. I moved around the room, checking every corner, my gaze sweeping over the dusty floorboards. The faint boot-like impressions I'd noticed yesterday were still there, perhaps a little clearer now, as if the dust had settled further into them. My eyes fell on the levers. They stood exactly as they had before, coated in their fine layer of rust, silent and immobile. Which one of them could have made such a sound? Had one of the heavy counterweights shifted? Unlikely. They were seized solid. I returned downstairs, baffled and uneasy. The logical part of my brain, the part that Clara had always admired and despaired of in equal measure, churned through possibilities. A large bird hitting the roof. A loose piece of metal somewhere in the structure, contracting in the cold morning air. But the sound had been so specific, so intentional. Like a dropped tool, or a lever being slammed home. The rest of that pre-dawn hour was spent in a state of hypervigilance. Sleep was out of the question. I made myself a strong cup of tea on my little camping stove, the hiss of the gas a comforting, mundane sound. As the first watery light of dawn began to illuminate the moors, painting the heather in shades of purple and gray, my resolve hardened. I wouldn't be scared out of my new home by a few unexplained noises. This was my sanctuary, damn it. The next few days, I threw myself into the conversion work with renewed, almost manic energy. I hired a local contractor, a taciturn man named Bill Armitage, to connect the water and electricity properly. He and his equally quiet apprentice arrived in a battered van, surveyed the signal box with expressions that gave nothing away, and set to work with gruff efficiency. "Queer old place you've got here, Mr. Davies," Bill remarked one afternoon, wiping grease from his hands on a rag. His Yorkshire accent was thick, comforting in its earthiness. "Not many folk fancy living out here, specially in one of these." "I like the isolation," I said, perhaps a little too defensively. "And the history." Bill grunted. "Aye, history it's got. Some of it best left buried, I reckon." He offered no more, and I didn't press him. The local tendency towards laconic understatement was something I was learning to navigate. While Bill and his lad wrestled with pipes and wires, I focused on the upper room. I bought new glass for the windows, painstakingly removing the old, grime-caked panes and replacing them. The difference was astounding. Clear, unfiltered light now flooded the space, chasing away the worst of the shadows, revealing the true colors of the faded paint on the walls, the intricate grain of the wooden floorboards. With the increased light, the faint smells I'd noticed earlier became more persistent. Not overpowering, but definitely present, especially in the still air of the morning or late evening. The dry, acrid scent of coal smoke, the slightly sweet, metallic tang of machine oil. And sometimes, another, fainter aroma, strong, stewed tea, the kind that railwaymen seem to live on. I found myself sniffing the air like a bloodhound, trying to trace them to a source, but they were diffuse, as if the very fabric of the building had absorbed them over decades. And then there was the cold. Not the general chill of an unheated old building, but specific, localized pockets of coldness. One was right by the main bank of levers, a patch of air that always felt a few degrees colder than the rest of the room, even when the sun was streaming in. Another was by the small window that overlooked the disused track bed. I'd stand there, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, yet my ankles would be inexplicably chilled. I started wearing thicker socks. The boot prints, too, became a quiet obsession. I avoided sweeping that particular area near the levers, watching them. They didn't change, didn't deepen, but they didn't fade either. They were simply there, silent testament to someone's long-repeated stance. I even took a photograph of them with my phone, the image looking frustratingly mundane, just smudges on a dusty floor. Clara would have called a psychiatrist. Or an exorcist. Or, more likely, would have packed her bags and decamped to the nearest sensible hotel. But I wasn't Clara. I was Arthur Davies, abstract painter, newly divorced, and determined to make this strange, stubborn little building my own. These quirks, I told myself, were just part of its character. The price of admission for such a unique space. I set up my largest easel by the newly glazed windows, facing out towards the vast, dramatic sweep of the moor. I stretched a fresh canvas, the pristine white surface a stark contrast to the weathered textures of the signal box. For the first time in months, a flicker of genuine artistic excitement stirred within me. This place, with its raw beauty and its subtle undercurrents of something, it was bound to inspire. The first few strokes were hesitant. I was out of practice, my creative muscles atrophied. But slowly, as the afternoon wore on and the light shifted across the landscape, something began to flow. Colors I hadn't intended, shapes that seemed to emerge from the canvas rather than from my own design. It was exhilarating and slightly unnerving. Bill Armitage finished the connections by the end of the week. Suddenly, I had reliable lights, power for my heater and kettle, and the promise of a hot shower once I got the plumbing installed. A small victory, but a significant one. He and his apprentice packed up their tools, gave me a curt nod, and rumbled off down the track, leaving me once more to the solitude of the signal box. That night, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. The work was progressing. The place was slowly, painstakingly, becoming mine. I made myself a proper meal, sat in a salvaged armchair I'd cleaned, and even read a few pages of a book. The wind was gentle, a mere whisper. I went to bed with a degree of peace I hadn't felt for some time. At 4:10 a.m., I found myself stirring, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I glanced at my watch. 2 minutes. I held my breath. The silence in the signal box was absolute. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Tick. 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 4:11 a.m. My muscles tensed. I was waiting for it. Expecting it. Tick. Tick. Then, precisely as the minute hand clicked over, clang. Loud. Resonant. Undeniable. It was followed, a split second later, by another sound, fainter this time, but just as distinct, the soft thud of something heavy, like a pair of work boots, hitting the wooden floorboards directly above my head. My blood ran cold. The clang, I could almost, try to explain away. But footsteps? Definite, human-sounding footsteps in a locked, empty room. I didn't move, didn't dare to breathe. I listened, every nerve ending screaming. Silence. The profound, echoing silence of the moorland night, now tainted with something watchful, something present. This wasn't just the old box settling. This was something else. Something that kept an appointment. Chapter 3, Whispers on the Wind. The silence that descended after the footsteps was heavier, somehow more menacing, than any sound. I lay rigid, every muscle coiled, listening with an intensity that made my ears ache. Minutes stretched into an eternity. No further sounds came from above. Only the relentless, quiet tick of my watch and the frantic thrum of my own pulse. Eventually, the gray light of another dawn began to filter in, and with it, a sliver of courage, or perhaps just the desperate need to confront the unknown. Armed once more with the poker, though feeling increasingly foolish wielding it against an invisible intruder, I climbed the stairs. The upper room was exactly as I'd left it. Sunlight, still weak and watery, slanted through the newly cleaned windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The bank of levers stood impassive, their rusted surfaces gleaming faintly. The floorboards were undisturbed, save for those persistent, faint boot-shaped impressions near the levers, impressions that now seemed to mock me with their stillness. There was no sign of entry, no displaced object. Nothing to explain the clang or the distinct thud of footsteps. Frustration warred with a gnawing fear. Was I losing my mind? Had the isolation, the stress of the divorce, finally unhinged something within me? Clara had always said I had an overactive imagination. But this felt too real, too specific. The 4:12 a.m. timing, the metallic clang, the undeniable weight of those steps. I spent the morning in a haze of anxiety, mechanically making tea, staring out at the moor, my mind replaying the sounds. The joy I'd felt in setting up my studio, the sense of a fresh start, felt tainted now, fragile. Later that day, driven by a restless energy, I found myself back in the upper room, not to paint, but to examine. I ran my hands over the cold iron of the levers, one by one. They were immense, deeply set, their mechanisms complex and hidden beneath the floor. Which one, if any, could have produced that clang? I tugged at a few, gingerly at first, then with more force. They were, as I'd suspected, seized solid, immovable monuments to a bygone era. Their colored handles, red for danger or stop, black for points, blue for locks, if my faint memory of railway lore served me, were chipped and faded, yet still hinted at their vital, urgent purpose. I paused before the largest lever, painted a stark, authoritative red. Its handle was smooth, almost polished in places from what must have been decades of use. It was here, near this lever, that the cold spot was most pronounced, and where the boot imprint seemed most defined. I reached out, my fingers tracing the cool curve of its handle. As my skin made contact, a peculiar sensation prickled through me. Not just the coldness of the metal, but something else, a faint, almost imperceptible vibration, like the distant thrum of a powerful engine. I pulled my hand back, startled. I pressed my palm against it again. Nothing. Just cold, dead iron. I shook my head, trying to dispel the growing sense of unease. It was the power of suggestion, my mind playing tricks. I was turning to leave, to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the room, when I heard it. It wasn't loud. It was barely a breath, a sigh of air so faint I almost missed it. It seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the room, from the space around the levers, or perhaps from the levers themselves. A whisper. Hoarse, dry, like autumn leaves skittering across stone. And the words, though barely audible, were chillingly clear, "The station isn't empty." I froze, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. My heart leaped into my throat, choking me. I spun around, eyes darting wildly. The room was still. Empty. Sunlight streamed in, indifferent. The moors stretched silent and vast beyond the windows. "Who's there?" I managed, my voice a strangled croak. "Show yourself." Only the wind answered, sighing softly around the eaves of the signal box, a mournful, knowing sound. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at me. This was no longer about unexplained noises or strange coincidences. This was communication. A direct address. And the implication was terrifying. I stumbled back, away from the levers, my hand instinctively going to my chest as if to calm my racing heart. My gaze was fixed on the bank of iron, now appearing less like inanimate objects and more like silent, watching entities. "The station isn't empty." The words echoed in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. Station? There was no station here, not anymore. The tracks were disused, the buildings long gone, if there ever were any substantial ones near this isolated box. Or did it mean the signal box itself? Was this the station it referred to? I fled the upper room, clattering down the narrow stairs with an undignified haste, the poker abandoned. Downstairs, I paced the small space, my mind reeling. I had to get out, if only for a few hours. I needed people, noise, normality. Within minutes, I was in the Land Rover, bumping along the rutted track towards Haverskill. The village, when I reached it, felt like a beacon of sanity. The sight of cottages with smoking chimneys, a dog barking in a garden, the postman doing his rounds, these mundane things were intensely reassuring. I found myself in the Drover's Arms, the village pub. It was early afternoon, and the place was quiet, only a couple of old men nursing pints by the fireplace and the landlord polishing glasses behind the bar. I ordered a pint of ale, my hand still shaking slightly as I paid. "Rough day," the landlord, a burly man with a weathered face named Mick, asked, his observation casual. "Just settling in," I said, trying for a nonchalant tone. "At the old signal box." "Low more." Mick raised an eyebrow. "Low more, eh? You're the artist chap, then. Heard someone bought it." He paused, his expression unreadable. "Brave man. Or a foolish one." One of the old men by the fire chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "More foolish, I'd wager, Ned." Now, Arthur," Mick said, using my name as if he'd known me for years, a common Yorkshire familiarity. "Don't mind Ned. He thinks anything further than his allotment is the edge of the world." He leaned forward slightly. "It's a bit of a bleak spot, mind. Got a bit of a reputation, has Low more." "Reputation?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What kind of reputation?" Mick shrugged, suddenly busy polishing a glass with great intensity. "Oh, you know. Old places, old stories. Folk talk. Not much else to do around here sometimes." Ned, the old man, piped up, his voice surprisingly strong. "Tragedy, that's what it's got. Bad business up at that box, years ago. Before my time, mostly, but my father used to talk of it." My heart quickened. "Tragedy? What happened?" Mick shot Ned a warning look, but the old man was already warming to his theme. "Big smash. Train collision. Right by the box. Nasty. Very nasty." He shook his head, his eyes distant. "Signalman's fault, they said. Or some said. Others whispered different." "That's enough, Ned," Mick said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Don't want to be spooking the man on his first pint." He turned to me. "Just old wives' tales, Mr. Davies. Place has been empty for donkey's years. Bound to gather a few stories. But the seed was planted. A train collision. A signalman. The station isn't empty." The words took on a new, chilling resonance. I finished my pint quickly, the taste of the ale suddenly bitter. I thanked Mick, nodded to Ned, and left the pub, the cheerful chatter feeling jarring against the turmoil inside me. Back in the Land Rover, I sat for a moment, staring out at the quiet village street. The information, scant as it was, churned in my mind. A deadly collision. A signalman under scrutiny. It wasn't much, but it was a starting point. It lent a grim context to the clang, the footsteps, the whisper. The drive back to Low Moor felt different. The moors, usually so open and liberating, now seemed to press in, imbued with a brooding watchfulness. The signal box, when it came into view, looked less like a quirky fixer-upper and more like a lonely, forgotten sentinel guarding a dark secret. That evening, I didn't even attempt to paint. The upper room, with its silent levers and the memory of that whisper, felt actively hostile. I stayed downstairs, the small electric heater doing little to dispel the chill that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the building. The smells were stronger tonight, coal smoke, sharp and acrid, and a heavy, cloying scent of hot oil. And underneath it all, something else, something I hadn't noticed before, a faint, metallic, almost coppery odor, like old rust, or dried blood. I pushed the thought away, disgusted with my own imagination. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful, plagued by images of twisted metal, screaming steam, and the accusing stare of the red signal lever. And at 4:12 a.m., precisely, the clang shattered the night, followed by the deliberate, heavy tread of boots on the floorboards above. This time, however, there was a new addition to the chilling symphony. A low groan. It wasn't a whisper. It was a sound of pain, or immense effort, muffled but undeniably human, seeming to emanate from the same spot as the footsteps, near the bank of levers. I lay there, rigid with terror, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The signal box wasn't just replaying sounds anymore. It felt like it was replaying a moment. A moment of agony. The station, indeed, was not empty. And whatever remained here was beginning to make its presence felt with terrifying clarity. My art, my fresh start, all of it felt insignificant, overshadowed by the growing certainty that I had stumbled into something far older and far more disturbing than I could ever have imagined. Chapter 4, The Stain on the Floorboards. The groan. That was the new horror. It wasn't just the mechanical clang or the ghostly footsteps anymore. It was organic, visceral. It spoke of suffering, of a human presence trapped in a loop of anguish. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat on my camp bed, the poker across my knees, listening to the wind, which seemed to carry on its breath the faint, lingering echo of that painful sound. By morning, a grim resolve had settled over me. Fear was still a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now overlaid with a desperate curiosity, a need to understand. If I was to reclaim any sense of peace, any hope of making this place my own, I had to confront whatever resided here, even if it was just in the historical record. My first port of call was the internet, accessed via a temperamental mobile hotspot. I typed in low Morse signal box history, Yorkshire railway accidents, and various combinations thereof. The results were initially sparse, mostly enthusiast sites for disused railway lines, filled with grainy photographs and technical specifications. But then, buried in a digitized local newspaper archive, I found it. A scanned headline from the Haverskill and District Chronicle, dated October 17, 1953, Tragedy on the Moor Line, Midnight Express collides with goods train. Several feared dead. My breath hitched. Midnight Express. Goods train. The words painted a vivid, terrible picture. I scrolled down, my finger trembling slightly on the mousepad. The article was brief, the details still emerging at the time of printing. It spoke of fog, a possible signaling error, and the horrific scene of the crash. Mention was made of the low Morse signal box, located perilously close to the point of impact. Further searching, cross-referencing dates and names, slowly began to piece together a more complete, and more horrifying, narrative. The crash had indeed been catastrophic. A southbound passenger express, running late and traveling at speed through a thick autumnal fog, had plowed into a slow-moving northbound goods train that was, inexplicably, on the same line. The impact had been devastating. The Chronicle's follow-up editions, which I painstakingly located, detailed the grim recovery efforts, the names of the deceased, 7 passengers, the express driver, and his fireman. And then, the name I'd been subconsciously bracing for, signalman Thomas Ashton. Ashton had been on duty in the Low Moor box that night. The official inquiry, the transcripts of which I found in a dusty corner of a Railway Historical Society website, painted a damning picture. Evidence suggested Ashton had incorrectly set the signals, allowing the express onto the occupied line. He'd vehemently denied it, claiming the levers had been stiff, that he'd followed procedure, that there was a fault in the interlocking mechanism. But the weight of evidence, or perhaps the need for a scapegoat, had fallen squarely on his shoulders. He wasn't charged with manslaughter, the inquiry deemed it an error of judgment under extreme pressure rather than malicious intent, but his career was over, his reputation ruined. The article spoke of a broken man, ostracized by the community, who had lived out his remaining years in Haverskill, a recluse. He died in the late 1960s, alone. The Low Moor signal box had been decommissioned a few years after the crash, the line eventually falling into disuse. I sat back, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating my pale face. Thomas Ashton. The man who would have stood where those boot prints were. The man whose hand would have gripped those levers. The man whose desperate, unheard pleas of mechanical failure now echoed in my own unsettling experiences. The clang at 4:12 a.m. The inquiry notes mentioned the express train was due to pass Low Moor at approximately 12:05 a.m., but had been running significantly late due to the fog and earlier delays. Could 4:12 a.m. have been the actual, terrible moment of impact? Or perhaps the moment Ashton realized his catastrophic error? The groan, was that his? The air in the signal box suddenly felt thick, heavy with the weight of that 50-year-old tragedy. The faint smells of coal and oil were no longer just quaint historical remnants, they were the olfactory ghosts of that fatal night. Driven by a morbid compulsion, I went upstairs. The upper room, usually my intended sanctuary, now felt like a stage, the levers the props in a grim, endlessly replaying drama. I walked over to the main bank, to the red lever, the one that always felt colder. I stared at the floorboards beneath it, at the faint, stubborn boot imprints. And then I saw it. Something I'd missed before, in my general sweeping and cursory glances. Not a stain on the surface, but something in the wood itself. A darker patch, roughly circular, almost indistinguishable from the natural grain and old grime unless you looked closely, in the right light. It was directly beneath the red lever, slightly to one side, as if something had dripped there, repeatedly, and soaked deep into the timber. My stomach churned. I crouched down, peering closer. The coppery scent I'd noticed the previous night, the one I'd dismissed, seemed to prickle faintly in my nostrils, stronger here than anywhere else. Blood? No, surely not. Not after all these years. It would be, absorbed, faded beyond recognition. Wouldn't it? But the thought, once lodged, refused to be dislodged. I thought of the force of the collision, the chaos, the injuries. Could Ashton himself have been injured? Or perhaps it wasn't Ashton's blood. Perhaps, in the aftermath, with the wreckage strewn just yards from the box, someone injured had been brought in. The whisper from the day before returned to me, sharp and clear, the station isn't empty. A new, chilling interpretation bloomed in my mind. It wasn't just Ashton's imprint here. The station, the signal box, had become a repository for the trauma of that night, for the lingering echoes of all those involved. The urge to paint, which had been slowly rekindling, was now entirely extinguished, replaced by a nauseous dread. I couldn't imagine standing here, trying to create, with the knowledge of what these walls had witnessed, what these floorboards might have absorbed. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I bought a bottle of cheap whiskey from the general store in Haverskill. Back in the signal box, I poured a generous measure, the fiery liquid doing little to warm the chill that seemed to have settled deep in my bones. I sat downstairs, the bottle beside me, and watched the light fade over the moors. I thought of Thomas Ashton, his life shattered by one foggy night, his desperate attempts to clear his name unheard. Was it his lingering frustration, his unresolved anguish, that I was sensing? Or was it something more complex, a confluence of all the fear and pain from that terrible collision? The 4:12 a.m. appointment was approaching. Usually, I'd be in bed, feigning sleep, waiting with a knot of dread. Tonight, I was wide awake, fueled by whiskey and a morbid sort of anticipation. I wouldn't hide. I would listen. I would bear witness. I turned off the electric heater, plunging the small downstairs room into near darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the grimy window. The only sounds were the sigh of the wind and the glug of whiskey as I refilled my glass. The minutes ticked by. 4 a.m. 4:05 a.m. The silence in the box deepened, became expectant. 4:10 a.m. I held my breath. 4:11 a.m. My hand tightened around the glass. Then, clang. Louder tonight, it seemed. Sharper. More violent. Immediately followed by the thud-thud of the boots hitting the floorboards above. Heavy. Hurried. And then the groan. Oh God, the groan. It was clearer this time, laced with a raw, guttural despair that made the hairs on my neck prickle. It wasn't just effort, it was agony, pure and unadulterated. But this time, there was more. A faint scraping sound, as if something heavy was being dragged. And then, a new whisper, different from the first. This one was weaker, laced with panic, almost a whimper. It won't move. God, it won't move. My blood ran cold. It was a voice tight with terror, the words choked out. Ashton's voice. Desperately trying to shift a jammed lever. The red one. The sequence played out, the clang, the frantic footsteps, the agonizing groan, the desperate whisper. And then, silence. A heavy, ringing silence that pressed down on me, suffocating. I sat there in the darkness, the whiskey forgotten, trembling. This wasn't just an echo. This was a replay. A fragment of a horrifying past, looping endlessly in the dead of night. And I was its unwilling audience. The next morning, I didn't even bother with the poker. I climbed the stairs slowly, my legs heavy, a profound weariness settling over me. The upper room was bright with morning sun, almost mockingly cheerful. The boot prints. The cold spot. The dark stain on the floorboards. They were all there, silent, irrefutable. I looked at my canvases, my paints. They seemed absurd, frivolous in the face of this lingering, visceral trauma. How could I paint abstract landscapes when the very air around me throbbed with a 50-year-old tragedy? As I stood there, staring at the red lever, a sudden, inexplicable urge came over me. I reached out, my fingers brushing against its cold, smooth handle. The faint thrumming sensation returned, stronger this time, like a current running beneath the rusted surface. And then, something shifted. Not in the room. In me. For a fleeting, disorienting second, my own hand, Arthur Davies's hand, felt alien. Thicker. Calloused. A working man's hand. And a thought, not my own, flashed through my mind with blinding clarity, the Up Express, she's late, fog's thick as treacle. I snatched my hand back as if burned, gasping. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at my hand, my own hand, pale, paint-stained in places, unmistakably mine. But the residual sensation, the phantom feel of another's flesh, the alien thought, it lingered, terrifyingly. The lines were blurring. The signal box wasn't just replaying its past. It was trying to draw me into it. And Thomas Ashton, or whatever remained of him, was no longer content to be a silent, suffering echo. He was reaching out, Chapter 5, the weight of a shadow. The phantom sensation in my hand, the alien thought, it was a turning point. The phenomena in the low Morse signal box were no longer just external assaults on my senses, they were beginning to infiltrate my own consciousness, to bleed into my very perception of self. The fear I'd felt before was now tinged with a more profound, existential dread, the fear of losing myself, of becoming subsumed by this place and its sorrowful occupant. I avoided the upper room for the rest of that day, confining myself to the cramped downstairs space. Even there, the atmosphere felt charged, the silence heavy with unspoken things. The smells of coal smoke and oil were pervasive, no longer ignorable, and the faint coppery tang seemed to cling to the back of my throat. I found myself compulsively washing my hands, as if trying to scrub away the lingering feel of that other, phantom touch. Sleep was a battlefield. I'd drift off, exhausted, only to be jolted awake by the slightest creak or sigh of the wind, my mind instantly on high alert, anticipating the 4:12 a.m. replay. When it came, it was with the same horrifying fidelity, the clang, the frantic boots, the groan of agony, the desperate whisper, it won't move. God, it won't move. Each night, it seemed to chip away another piece of my resolve, leaving me more frayed, more vulnerable. I tried to paint downstairs, setting up a small easel in the corner, but my efforts were futile. My hand felt clumsy, disconnected. The colors I mixed were muddy and lifeless. The vibrant, abstract energy that usually flowed through me was choked off, damned by the oppressive weight of the signal box's past. Instead of capturing the wild beauty of the moors, my canvases reflected the turmoil within me, fractured lines, discordant colors, a sense of suffocating confinement. One afternoon, desperate for a distraction, for any semblance of normality, I drove into Haverskill, not to the pub this time, but to the small, volunteer-run village library. It was housed in a converted chapel, a quiet, dusty haven smelling of old paper and beeswax polish. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, perhaps just a respite, a place where the only whispers were the turning of pages. The librarian, a kindly, bespectacled woman named Mrs. Gable, seemed surprised to see a new face. I mumbled something about local history, and she pointed me towards a small, rather neglected section. There, amongst a collection of parish records and faded local histories, I found a thin, self-published booklet titled Memories of the Moorland Line, compiled by a local railway enthusiast decades ago. I settled into a creaky wooden chair and began to read. Much of it was technical data and reminiscences of former railway workers. But then, a chapter caught my eye, the Low Moor incident. It recounted the 1953 collision, largely echoing what I'd already discovered online. But there were a few additional details, anecdotal accounts from people who had lived in the area at the time. One paragraph leaped out at me. Old man Hemlock, who farmed near the cutting, always swore he heard shouting from the signal box just before the crash. Said it sounded like two men arguing, one frantic, the other, well, he never could describe the other. Just said it wasn't right. Of course, everyone knew Tom Ashton was on duty alone that night. Poor fellow. The fog does strange things to sound on the moor, and Hemlock was known for his drams. Two men arguing. But Ashton was alone. Or was he? The official inquiry had made no mention of a second person. Was it just a drunken farmer's fancy, amplified by the fog and the tragedy? Or was there another layer to this story, another presence that night? The booklet also contained a grainy, poorly reproduced photograph of the Low Moor signal box, taken sometime in the early 1950s, before the crash. It looked starker then, newer, but unmistakably the same structure. Standing on the narrow external platform outside the upper room, leaning against the rail, was a figure. A man in a railwayman's uniform, his face obscured by shadow and the poor quality of the print. Thomas Ashton, presumably. He looked small against the vastness of the moor, a solitary figure in his lonely outpost. Looking at that faded image, a strange sense of connection, almost pity, stirred within me. This man, whoever he was, whatever his failings, had suffered immensely. His entire life had been defined, and destroyed, by one terrible night in this very building. As I drove back to the signal box, the moorland landscape seemed to mirror my own internal state, vast, empty, and tinged with a profound melancholy. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched and distorted the familiar shapes of the heather and rock. That night, the 4:12 a.m. replay was, if possible, even more intense. The groan was deeper, raw with a despair that vibrated through the floorboards. The whispered, "It won't move," was sharper, edged with a rising hysteria. And for the first time, I heard something else, interwoven with the groan, so faint I almost dismissed it as the wind, a soft, rhythmic weeping. The sound chilled me to the core. It was the sound of utter desolation. The next morning, I forced myself upstairs. I had to. I couldn't let this thing drive me out. As I reached the top step, I paused. The air in the upper room felt different. Heavier. Colder. The smells of coal smoke and oil were almost overpowering, and the coppery tang was undeniably present. I walked towards the bank of levers, my gaze fixed on the red one. The boot imprints on the floor seemed darker, more defined, as if fresh. My heart hammered against my ribs. As I neared the levers, I felt it again, that subtle, disorienting shift in my own perception. A wave of profound weariness washed over me, a bone-deep exhaustion that wasn't my own. My shoulders slumped. My hand, of its own accord, rose, fingers twitching, as if aching to grasp something familiar. Got to check the block instruments, signal the train entering section to Haverskill. The thought, clear and precise, unspooled in my mind, accompanied by a vivid mental image of the complex array of bell codes and indicator needles that would have been part of Ashton's duties. I staggered back, shaking my head violently, trying to dislodge the alien intrusion. "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Get out of my head." The feeling receded, like a wave drawing back, leaving me shaken and breathless. But the residue remained, the echo of another man's thoughts, another man's routines, clinging to me like cobwebs. I noticed something else. On the dusty sill of the small window overlooking the track bed, the one where I often felt the inexplicable cold spot around my ankles, was a new mark. A single, clear fingerprint in the thick dust, as if someone had recently leaned there, looking out. It wasn't mine. My own prints were smudged, indistinct from my cleaning efforts. This was sharp, defined. The dominant imprint, Thomas Ashton's, was becoming more assertive, more interactive. It wasn't just replaying its trauma, it was beginning to react to my presence, to test its influence. My artistic impulse, long dormant, flickered with a desperate, almost perverse, energy. If I couldn't escape this, perhaps I could understand it, process it, through my art. I grabbed a large canvas, set it on the easel, and picked up a palette knife. I didn't consciously choose the colors. Dark blues, grays, slashes of visceral red. My movements were jerky, frantic. I wasn't painting the Moor, I was painting the inside of the signal box, the oppressive atmosphere, the weight of the unseen. Hours passed in a blur. I didn't stop to eat or drink. I was driven by a compulsive need to get something out, to exorcise the sensations that were threatening to overwhelm me. The image emerging on the canvas was chaotic, disturbing, a maelstrom of abstract shapes that nevertheless seemed to hint at the rigid geometry of the levers, the suffocating confines of the room, a sense of impending doom. When I finally stepped back, exhausted, sweat dripping down my face, I stared at the canvas in horrified fascination. It was unlike anything I had ever painted before. It was raw, brutal, and deeply unsettling. And in the center of the chaotic composition, almost hidden within the layers of paint, was a shape that chillingly resembled a single, staring eye, rendered in a bloody crimson. As I looked at it, a wave of intense, inexplicable sadness washed over me, so profound it brought tears to my eyes. It wasn't my sadness. It was too deep, too old, too steeped in a grief I had no personal claim to. It felt like Ashton's sorrow, his despair, channeled through me, onto the canvas. The air in the room grew colder. The scent of machine oil became acrid, biting. I heard a faint sigh, right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. But then, from the direction of the levers, came a new sound. Not a whisper this time. Not a groan. A name. My name. Arthur. It was faint, raspy, tinged with an overwhelming weariness, yet unmistakably directed at me. The brush clattered from my nerveless fingers. The dominant imprint wasn't just aware of me anymore. It knew my name. And it was trying to speak to me directly. The fight to retain my own identity, my own sanity, had just become terrifyingly personal.